Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after lunch for our third panel of the day. This is multipolarity, connectivity, or competition. And so today we have a panel of 5 guests, but I'm only going to introduce the moderator and leave Carlos Roa, the moderator, who's a Danube Institute fellow and former executive editor of the National Interest. I'll leave him to actually introduce the panelists and the panel theme. All right, thank you very much. Carlos, take it away.
Thank you, Callum. Well, first of all, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. And now comes what I feel is the most exciting panel. And no, I'm not just saying that because it's my panel, so don't worry about that. The topic of this panel is multipolarity. So for those of you who have been in international relations, this used to be kind of a naughty word a few years ago. You couldn't suggest it. But now, at this point, it's kind of broadly recognized that the world is heading in a multipolar direction, that the US-led unipolar order is, depends who you ask, either on its way out or is out. Some would say, some would feel reluctant, but generally it's agreed we're heading that direction. Because of this, we are in an era of transition, and this is manifested via fissures in all realms. In military, either war in Ukraine, potential tensions over Taiwan, even less noted issues such as the Red Sea, the West pulling out of the Sahel, tensions between Venezuela and Guyana or Espirito, all sorts of things. Economically, we see rewiring of supply chains, energy markets, the rise of new economic corridors such as the Middle Corridor in Central Asia, or the India, Middle East, European Economic Corridor, IMEC. And in culture, we also see, and I'm sure you've heard of this or will hear about it, fights over liberalism, wokeism, or just the changes in media, as we see now, more global diversity, shall we say, of media rather than what used to be a very Western-centric approach. So we live in a transition period, and no one is exactly sure what will come next. We have ideas and variations, and that's what we're here to talk about. We head towards a multipolar world. What will that look like in practice? Will it be great power competition, formation of blocks, or will it be something more cooperative with states pursuing a strategy of connectivity? That's what we're here to discuss. And I think perhaps the best place to start, where a good leading point, is India, on the basis that its second largest population, probably be first in a few years. It is the largest growing major economy and will be the third largest economy by the end of the decade, and go on with the reasons. And to help guide us in this discussion, I'd introduce Dr. Forgive me, I'm horrible with names. It takes me a few days to learn it. Swapan Dasgupta. Dr. Dasgupta is a renowned Indian writer, commentator, political activist, and a national executive of the BJP party. So, Doctor, floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos. In many ways, I feel like an interloper in this gathering, which is supposed to be a conversation involving Europe and America. But Hungary has its own definite charms. And I must first thank the hosts in Hungary, not merely because of their splendid hospitality, but because Hungary has carved out a niche for itself as one of the foremost defenders of national identity, of national sovereignty, and of making civilization a basis of nationhood. These are spectacular achievements in this age where we talk about the melting pot of globalization, where everyone is supposed to be exactly the same. Earlier this morning, we heard quite a riveting and some might say a very recondite discussion on the labels, whether we should approach the term conservatism, whether we should use populism, or whether we should use national conservatism. It's a very interesting discussion. The only thing is that if we accept that, somehow India falls off the map. Because the term conservatism doesn't have a natural equivalent in any Indian languages. I recall that many, many years ago, many decades ago, when I first described myself as a conservative, somehow people used to think you're some sort of an orthodox religious fanatic who doesn't believe in any change and who wears a long pigtail, something out of the 18th century. The term doesn't have any resonance in India. The term which has some resonance in India is the term nationalist. But again, here we have a problem. The term nationalist can easily be appropriated by both the right as well as the left, as well as the center. The entire history of India from about the beginning of the 20th century can be termed as really the ascendancy of nationalism. So, when people today talk about nationalists, it has a certainly different meaning. Because there are others who want to say that they are, to use the terminology of a British writer, they are the everywhere people, and we nationalists are the somewhere people. We are rooted, and they feel that they are far more cosmopolitan. And I think here we come across this whole question of multipolarity. Again, multipolarity is not something unique in the Indian context. Throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, the first Prime Minister of India used to use it as a synonym for non-alignment. Now, non-alignment was an interesting club. It covered a multitude of sins, like the concept of the third world. In Mr. Nehru's imagination, it meant standing up for the anti-colonial struggles and sort of riling certain people in the Commonwealth. Notably, Mr. Malan in South Africa. Tony Abbott's here, he'll remember Robert Menzies was one of his favorite targets. I think Robert Menzies liked cricket more than Nehru did. So it meant that. And for instance, in 1956, when the Hungarian uprising took place, the so-called non-alignment somehow disappeared. It became alignment with the Soviet tanks. Again, when the Soviet tanks moved into Afghanistan in 1980, there was no non-alignment there. It meant alignment with progressive forces, as it were. So, when we are talking about multipolarity here, at this time, it's very important to look at the context. In terms of terminology, we can always find a parallel between the connectivity, which Viktor Orban used in one of his speeches I read on the web, and what we in India call strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is a bit of a mouthful, but it conveys more or less the same thing. Except that India's role as a passive player is no longer there. Earlier, as I said, India could always pretend that we are a quality in world affairs. It's a very sort of pompous sort of sounding thing. And that quality meant that while you didn't have the economic resilience, you could be very preachy to the world. And I think one of the things which irritated various people from President Kennedy onwards to others was the fact that India was excessively preachy. Now that preachiness has gone out of the window. It's been replaced by a more pragmatic understanding whereby it's realized that, okay, sometimes Australians play better cricket than us, but they are worthwhile partners. That South Africa is a worthwhile partner, never mind its past. That today we can talk about the United States without the same Cold War lens as that happened in the past. That you can have a relationship with Hungary which need not conflict with your relationship with the bureaucracy in Brussels. And I think the best case scenario of that happened in the Ukraine issue. Now, when the Ukraine war began, the priority of India was to get the students who'd gone there on a sort of discounted medical degree program. I think Melbourne was shortchanged in that process. And to get them out as soon as possible without them becoming collateral casualties of this conflict. And we managed that very successfully, extremely successfully, and I think the Hungarian government too played a very important role in facilitating that. But it was always clear that this was not our war. This was a war of Europe, never mind the rights and the wrongs of it. This was a war which really involved the Europeans, and that we must exercise for our national interest what was best for us. And that meant that when the sanctions against Russia were imposed, we didn't necessarily go with it. And that we bought more cheap energy from Russia, which enabled us to control our domestic inflation far more successfully. And I think that's a very classic, good example of the type of maneuverability which is there. We have a wonderful relationship which had its ups and downs called the Quad with Australia, with the United States. And that, to some people, is the proverbial hedge against China. It is perceived in a lot of quarters. May not be completely illegitimate perception, but I think there is more to that. That India is also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation thing, where China is a major player. We also happen to be one of the promoters of something which is quaintly called I2U2, which is a form of the Abrahamic Accord which President Trump had initiated in the United States, which enables us to have Israel and the United Arab Emirates on the same table, and Saudi Arabia, and of course there's an attempt to get Egypt too on board. So, our relationship with Israel has deepened and intensified over the past 15 years. We see ourselves as somehow connected, not merely in terms of strategic interest, but also in a certain civilizational sort of way. We see ourselves being very connected. But that does not mean that you actually ignore the reality of the Muslim world in the Gulf. It's a tough balancing act, but it's a balancing act which has to be done. So I can well appreciate those who say that it's not necessary that a one-size-fits-all policy should determine the future of the world. And that national interest does not necessarily mean that it is inimical to the cause of peace. One of the biggest problems we have with the European Union is confronting its infuriating, sanctimonious preachiness. I understand it is not a unique problem. That there are others who've confronted it in various ways on the question of immigration, etc. And on immigration too. We cannot, a responsible country like India cannot support the odd members of who happen to be citizens of our country, who climb onto boats or pretend that they are seeking political asylum or something like that. Each country must have the right to determine its own immigration policy. That may be dependent on labor requirements, it may be dependent on skill requirements, it may be dependent on hundreds of things. But that's their issue. And we give that, and no one can take away that sovereign right. And I think it's important that increasingly more and more countries must recognize that you must talk to each other, confer with each other, engage with each other, keeping in mind that national sovereignty is very, very important. I know China believes that national sovereignty is very important, and as a result, they too are quite picky about not interfering in human rights and other conflict issues on the question of national sovereignty. That might be the case for them. But then we have problems with the entire issue of one belt, the Belt and Road policy and the hegemonism. It's a conflict, but which is a conflict which need not necessarily result in wars. So, all I want to say is that yes, it is quite apparent that there are tensions which may come about with the United States in the event the Democrats win. The notion of a regime change for good, which I think someone in the earlier part of the session in the morning spoke about, is something which a lot of people in India are concerned about. Not merely because it's happened in a neighborhood country of ours, but also because it can have other implications. Likewise, I think there is a tacit deal of approval for the so-called realism, which says that the United States need not always be a player in every part of the world. And that also is something which we approve of. But how the Americans vote is something for the Americans. It's not for us to interfere in. And we'll have to take the good with the bad, whatever happens. I don't think it would be a sad day if other countries were to have laws like the Australians passed about restricting Chinese involvement in their domestic politics. That is an unnecessary situation for any other part of the world. So that sense of, when we talk about multipolarity, let us be friends, but let us recognize that we all have different ways in which we see the world, that our cultural roots are different, and we must respect that. And it's that sense of mutual respect, which I think, if it comes about in the world, whether it emanates from India, whether it emanates from Hungary, whether it emanates from the United States, it doesn't matter. As long as it leads to that same thing. I think that's a different sort of world where a different sort of mosaic can be drawn up. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. Now let's dive into the discussion and let's hear perspectives and comments from our panelists. Let's start with Professor Damjan Krnjevic, Director of Policy Research at the Institute for Development and Diplomacy at AD University, and full disclosure, he used to be my boss. So So it'll be quite fun.
Thank you. All right, I want to make two basic points this afternoon, building on what Bala Shorban and Lord Frost and others have said. The first involves sketching out a worldview that is becoming increasingly difficult for leaders in the West to understand. For those who run the United States at the moment, and for those who administer the European Union and govern many of its most relevant member states. Their situation is made more precarious by the fact that everyone else, especially all of the major non-Western powers, totally understand this traditional or realist or conservative way of thinking about the globe. And this includes India. And I think we got an indication of this earlier on. Now, in world politics, there's no apodictic solution to the problem of justice or the sempiternity of upheaval. Disorder can't be transcended for the rather obvious reason that human nature is not pliable like Play-Doh. Play-Doh, not Plato. And too many in the West, I think, have deceived themselves into confusing humanity's indisputable technological advancement with the illusion that for what they take as sort of moral progression or moral progress. And they've deceived themselves into truly believing that war is like a Hollywood movie, where the good guy wins in the end. My point is that for thousands of years, there has existed a correlation between extended periods of stability and a common commitment to the legitimacy of an international system that's based on some version of maintaining a balance of power between major players. And this is in turn predicated on a common acknowledgement of relative weakness by those same players, whereby each major power concedes that it can't dominate others without incurring heavy costs or too heavy costs, and thus concludes that it's better off not trying to do so. But no balance of power system has ever been designed to eliminate crises and conflicts. When functioning properly, they're meant to limit the scope of war and domination. And they're never aimed at achieving Kantian perpetual peace, Hegelian universal and homogeneous state, or any other this kind of nonsense. Obviously, a balance of power system keeps everyone's dissatisfaction at a low enough level to not result in attempts to overthrow the basic tenets of the system. And that's absolutely not what we're seeing today. Now, this brings me to my second point. I want to reflect a little bit on what I've just laid out in the context of one of the world's most consequential geopolitical and geoeconomic theaters. And it's one that remains woefully below the radar for most policymakers and commentators in the West, which I think is a grave mistake. I'm talking about a region that's known by various names: Core Eurasia, Inland or Continental Asia, the Trans-Caspian, or what I call the Silk Road region. So basically, we're talking about part of the world that involves the 3 South Caucasus states and the 5 Central Asian states. Now, there are various other countries that are bound in whole or in part to this region. And these include Turkey and Iran, but also Russia, India, China, and so on. And those ties are genuine, and some of them go back hundreds, thousands of years. But countries like this that don't really belong to the core of the region. And this is true no matter what the grounds are that you want to sort of make this judgment on, whether they're geopolitical or geoeconomic or whatever it is. The strategic reason why focusing on the Silk Road region makes sense is because this is where some of the world's most consequential connectivity projects are being constructed. And so, well, perhaps more than anywhere else, to get to the title of what we're supposed to be talking about today, this is where the feasibility of strategic connectivity projects and some version of globalization stands or falls in the 21st century. What I'm seeing is that the Silk Road region is right on the cusp of being ready for geopolitical and geoeconomic prime time. And unfortunately, this is neither fully nor properly understood by major outside powers, including, I think, the United States, the EU, if we can call it a power, some of the EU's main member states, and I think India, unfortunately. But in contrast, China and Russia really get this. And I think the UK sort of gets this, or at least previous governments did. Let's see if these guys can figure it out. Now, to make all of this more concrete, I want to give you a couple of characteristics of this part of the world, of what I call the Silk Road region. The first characteristic is its geostrategic location. It stands between the world's two most critically important regions, the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic basins. It's also the area where the Turkic world comes into contact with all of its neighbors, and where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the CSTO, this Russian-led security apparatus, comes into contact with NATO. It's also where two game-changing connectivity projects, the Belt and Road Initiative and the Middle Corridor, where they blend into one another, but also where they intersect with a third, which is called the International North-South Transportation Corridor, which is this sanctions-busting corridor that starts in Russia, goes through Azerbaijan or the Caspian, or on the eastern side, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, enters into Iran, gets to the Persian Gulf, and then on to India and the rest of South Asia. So the Silk Road region represents a strategic gateway between different blocks of states and regional associations and civilizational groupings. Now, this should be even more obvious when one sees that the routes of two other significant connectivity projects are immediately adjacent to the Silk Road region. So there's something called the Development Road. This is a trade corridor that Iraq and Turkey are pushing. And then there's something called CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which obviously links Pakistan to China. And these two can be understood to be complementary to, or at least feed into, the central route of the Middle Corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative, which are obviously different in a lot of the details, but conceptually, the Middle Corridor project and the Belt and Road project are conceptually coherent. Now, we've also got the 3 Seas Initiative, which could be categorized in similar terms, if it can be connected to the Black Sea and thus to the Middle Corridor. And if that comes to life, as Jim Carafano, who may or may not be here, is advocating, and it looks like that will actually happen. Look, the Silk Road region is already a strong and a predictable and a stable and a reliable and growing supplier of hydrocarbons, both oil and gas, primarily brought to consumers via pipeline networks that are not sanctioned by anybody. Also, it has the potential to export electricity produced from wind and solar and a little bit of hydro. The potential is massive and huge. It's apparently, according to the World Bank and the EBRD and so on, amongst the greatest in the world. And it looks like these projects are actually taking off. There are some undersea cables that are being built that will have massive capacity and so on. And so already now you've got 10% of Europe's oil and gas that is being fed from this part of the world. It looks like about 20% of renewables, wind and solar, is going to come from this part of the world towards Europe. That's not bad. Now, things get a little more complicated when one considers the implications of the route of IMEC, right, the India, Middle East, European Economic Corridor. And this is presented by its advocates as a strategic alternative, essentially, to the Belt and Road Initiative, but also by implication to the Middle Corridor. And you can see this by the purposeful exclusion of Turkey, and also by India's unfortunate choice to focus its strategic attention in the context of sort of core Eurasia towards Armenia. And as a consequence, it's possible that India is going to close itself off to all of the strategic opportunities that are on offer in that part of the world. And that's weird because India tends to pick winners. You know, if you look at the way that India has begun to project its power and influence abroad, it always tends to pick the right set of partners in specific regions. And for some reason, this is not happening in that part of the world, and that's unfortunate. In any event, it seems to me that the EU, to some extent, and most of its member states are making a similar mistake. And why is this important? Well, because I don't think that you could really conceive of, free and open spaces without taking into account the Silk Road region or sort of core Eurasia. Because otherwise you're simply yielding this genuinely strategic part of the world to Russia and to China, and at no cost to them. And this may very well be geopolitical and geoeconomic malpractice. Now, I obviously have more to say, and I don't want to get into it too much now because time is short, but I do want to emphasize three, what I think to be important sort of traits, or let's say values that bring together the core countries of this part of the world, and I need a minute to do this. Silk Road values prioritize allegiance to a strong state with an economically interventionist government. The regional logic here is that a weak state can more easily result in a failing state. And a lot of these countries, not too long ago, were maybe moving in that direction. Now that's thankfully changed, but still it continues to be a preoccupation of the people who run these places. And a weak state also allows foreign capital to influence national economic decision-making more easily. That's the logic of that argument, which can have a whole bunch of undesirable consequences. The second sort of Silk Road value embraces industrial policy as an integral part of national security policy. And this is about having both the ambition and the power to mobilize the entirety of a region's resources to get behind larger aspirational goals. Right? In the political science literature, this is called a project state. And then the third Silk Road value that I want to say something about is that there's no concept of sort of sublimating distinct state identities in the name of institutionalizing cooperation amongst themselves, like some of the federalists in the context of the European Union are trying to do, right? And certainly not amongst themselves, but even less amongst outsiders. So in other words, borders are not mere lines on a map. They're sovereign markers of territorial integrity, and they represent an axiomatic basis of each country's identity and its architectonic definition of itself. And this goes to the point that Bala Shorban was talking about earlier today in the context of sort of the era of sovereignty. So you have this rise in the championing of norms that privilege state security and civilizational diversity and traditional social and cultural values in that part of the world. Now, by implication here, those of you who understand these kind of things will immediately see that there's a natural compatibility with a lot of the other issues that we've been talking about. And yet, again, this part of the world is really not being taken seriously for its potential, its geopolitical and its geoeconomic potential. And that's a huge shame. Now, let me wrap this up. The major outside powers that truly grasp the implications of all of this will, I think, and I'm convinced, be the ones that tomorrow will come out on top in the great connectivity game where the rules are now being set. Not just in the context of the Silk Road region, but broadly, globally. But this requires coming back to a commonsensical understanding of statecraft, which is far more than the mere sum of your intentions or of your aspirations. And I think that the contemporary West is going to have to play catch-up, because statecraft really isn't a morality play. It's not an excuse in telling others how to avoid perdition. And it's not a walk down the path that leads to total victory every time you step up to the plate. That's simply not how the world has ever worked, nor will it ever work. What statecraft requires most is a clinical examination of what cannot be achieved. Only then can strategy be fruitfully contemplated and policy prudentially executed. Now, in the context of the Silk Road region, and in the context of every other geopolitical and geoeconomic theater, that's what the West needs to remember how to do again properly. Otherwise, we're just not going to make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Damjan. Next, Professor Doug Stokes, Professor of International Security and Strategy, the University of Exeter.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here. I have very hastily prepared notes, so you have to forgive me. These notes come from a new piece in the Hungarian Conservative, and it's mainly refracted through the lens of Hungary's connectivity strategy. And I'm going to strike a slightly contrarian line here, insofar as if multipolarity is the structural variable within which connectivity or Hungary's connectivity has to operate, I don't think that we're in a deep multipolar international system. I think we're in a shallow multipolar international system. That's really the key takeaway from my talk. And what do I mean by that? If China is the major axis around which multipolarity is organised, I think China going forward is on a bit of a rocky road. I think if you look at the hard data on China, you look at the FDI stats, they've completely dropped off the picture. Its currency cannot possibly become internationalized given the non-financialization of its capital accounts, transparency issues. There are all kinds of problems. I think one of the most important problems that we see, and I'll talk about this in the European context, is the demographic problem that you see in China. If China is a manufacturing nation and it's running out of young people and people to make things, and it's getting an older population, it's in deep trouble. I think also the wobbles that we've seen in terms of geopolitics and the onshoring and friendshoring that started really hardcore under Trump, but also the Biden administration, and I think will continue into the future, has increasingly cutting China out of various global supply chains. It's still very important, there's no doubt about that, and in particular areas there are major strategic vulnerabilities, rare earths, critical minerals, etc., but the nations are also calibrating themselves around that too. So, and then you think about the Xi Jinping regime, the CCP regime, and we talk about China's national interest, but we're really talking about CCP national interests. So I think that Xi Jinping has kind of purged other centres of intellectual, political, military power in China. And so I think what he's done there is he's created kind of a low information echo chamber around himself, and that is never very good for longevity when you're talking about strategic leadership. And I don't say this with any glee, by the way. I think China's rise and it's the growth of the Chinese middle class is a wonderful thing, by the way, and development's a wonderful thing. But I think if you look at that in realist terms, in terms of hard power, I think China is in a bit of a rocky road. So to the extent that Hungary wishes to pursue a connectivity strategy, which I think is a perfectly rational strategy, it has to do so on the strategic basis that multipolarity is what I argue in the Hungarian conservative piece that I think is forthcoming quite soon. We are in a shallow multipolar international system. We're not in a mature multipolar international system. If China is the key axis around which multipolarity or bipolarity is organised, I think the US still has incredible elements of national power, international reserve currency status of the dollar, incredible military power, most of which we don't even know about, with developing all kinds of high tech. The network centricity of the US as well in terms of global security regimes, global monetary regimes, global financial regimes. So I think the 21st century will remain an American century, not in the unipolar rah-rah-rah sense, but in terms of hard power. I think the 21st century will be a multipolar system, but it will still be quite largely US-centric. How about Europe as a sort of strategic snapshot? So many of the problems you see in China are also happening in Europe. If the EEC and the EU was really all about the constitutionalization of German power, and it was, i.e., how do you solve the German problem? If Germany gets very strong, well, what tends to happen is it starts to develop a military power too. And we saw that twice in the 20th century. So the whole point of the EEC, steel and coal, and the EU was about the constitutionalization of German power. Germany will become strong economically, but how do you constitutionalize that within a pan-European framework that prevents Germany's militarization? So Germany's really always been at the heart of the EU. Whenever there's an EU crisis, you don't get on the blower to Portugal or to Spain. Who do you speak to? You speak to Germany. So Germany's going a really strange way now. It's very similar dynamics to China, where you've got a kind of demographic collapse in Germany, very heavy reliance on exports, essentially, which is now going down the pan too with China. I can go into some of the data in the paper that's forthcoming. I go over a lot of the data on this. It's much more fleshed out than what I'm giving here. So I think that the German decline, industrial decline, exacerbated by extraordinarily bad choices, strategic choices at the leadership level. Net zero, the decommission of nuclear plants, to the extent that they're now relying on lignite coal to power German industry. It's one of the dirtiest forms of energy you could possibly have. It's ridiculous. But others have spoken far more articulately about these kinds of problems than I can. So Germany basically is on a bit of a downward slope. So what then does that mean for the balance of power in Europe? You can forget all this nonsense about supranationalism and the brotherhood of man and blah, blah, blah. Essentially, within the EU, it is about the articulation or the supranational elements of the EU exist, obviously, but the leadership of it is always overdetermined by the national interests of the powerful states within the EU. And each state within it has to make a calculation, a cost-benefit calculation, as to whether the benefits of staying in outweigh the benefits of leaving. Only one state, the Brits, so far have made that choice, but we'll see what happens in the future. So the balance of power is shifting in the EU. Germany is going down. And it's going down economically, and it's going down in other ways too, demographically, etc. And it has to make some quite hard choices. What then does that mean about the balance of power in Europe? Where will it go? I think the future of Europe will be an American light security order. Whoever wins the election, the American election, I think the Americans are on a pathway to a kind of much more of an American light, NATO light European security order. If Trump gets in, he'll put it on steroids, I suspect. If Kamala gets in, whatever happens, the structures are there. The Americans don't want to keep paying huge amounts of money to keep rich liberal democracies safe, and that's a fair point. And every administration has made that, the Bush, Obama, on and on and on. So whatever happens, we are entering into a more American-like security order. What then does that mean? It means the wet blanket the Americans have thrown over security competition in Europe is going to get pulled back, and more forms of security competition will begin to bubble up. You're seeing it already. So essentially the centre of military land power now is shifted decisively towards Poland. Poland in the next 5-10 years, already pretty much will be one of the most preeminent land powers in Europe. So the power is shifting east to Poland, and that will work very well for Hungary's national interests going forward. So the connectivity strategy makes a lot of sense in that way. It'll also go up north with the Scandinavian countries, etc. They border Russia, and Russia, absent a resolution on the Ukraine crisis or whatever happens, Russia, unless we can have a new grand bargain with Russia, a post-NATO security architecture grand bargain with Russia, Russia will be at the centre of strategic thinking in Western Europe and Eastern European states. So the Scandinavians bordering Russia will be an incredibly important part of it. The Brits too. If we can pull the fingers out of I won't finish that sentence. If we can sort ourselves out and sort out our defence procurement and stop these idiotic... I think the administration we currently have is the last hurrah of the professional managerial classes and the kind of supranationalism. I think that they're going to be swept away, hopefully, and then we can begin to think more in a more realist fashion. If the UK can sort out its defence procurement and its issues with its Ministry of Defence, all of which the issues often bedevil the public sector, I think the UK will be a very interesting player. It's a long sort of strategic player in European security. I think it can leverage its security superintendents and its security alliances quite well if we can sort that out. So I think Europe will become more of a increasingly dominated by geopolitical and security considerations. The key vector for that is how that influences the EU, what that does to the EU as a geopolitical actor. It's not a geopolitical actor. It's a normative actor, and it does a lot of this, the yada, 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 but it doesn't ultimately have that power projection, and it relies on the Americans. So absent the Americans, what then will begin to happen to the European security order? So to wrap this up, to the extent that Hungary is a part of various alliances, NATO, EU, etc. It's enmeshed within transnational, supranational, international frameworks and alliances. That is just what it is. To the extent that its connectivity strategy relies upon a reading of the international system and its hedging strategy, it's trying to sort of play to various camps. To the extent that Hungary's connectivity strategy takes multipolarity as a mature one, and one in which you could build an axis around China, I think that's a mistake. I think we are seeing shifts in the global balance of power. I think China long term is on is not on a great path. But I think the shifting balance of power in the European politics will work very well for Hungary going forward. Thank you very much.
Up next, we have Glen Howard, former president of the Jamestown Foundation.
You got me? Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot for having me here. I'm Glen Howard, former president of the Jamestown Foundation, which I led for over 20 years. I'm now writing a Substack. You can find me on there called writing. The Substack is called Eyes on Eurasia, and so I have a very successful podcast. It's developing quite well. My background experience is in this area. It's my first trip to Hungary. But I do know something about Eurasia. I've traveled extensively throughout the region, Central Asia, Caucasus, and also Iran and Turkey. And so my experience has also come from working with Dr. Zbigniew and Brzezinski for 4 years and now Hague. So I'm not new to this area, but Hungary is certainly a new topic for me. And I certainly, when we think about Hungary today, I've tried to understand the context and the strategic context for Turkey, I mean not Turkey, but for the way Hungary is evolving. Now, my wife is from Izmir, and she's from Turkey, and so they call the Magyars, the Magyar Turks is a term they often use, but the common, in fact, my wife's brother's name was Attila. So many of you know the commonalities between the two regions. So I can certainly understand where Hungary's geopolitical position, interests go. Many of you may be familiar with the very well-known Turkologist Arminus Vamberi, who traveled throughout Central Asia and the Caucasus, and he was a part of the Great Game. So this area is certainly one that I've spent a great deal of time trying to understand in terms of the geopolitics. Now, part of this discussion is to talk about connectivity and multipolarity. And I once worked in the Pentagon. There was a great strategist by the name of Andy Marshall, and I worked for him for over 20 years. Or he certainly worked he was in the Pentagon in his position as the head of net assessment, an office in the Pentagon. His job was to look at the futures of Eurasia and the rest of the world and try to understand where the world was going. And he was certainly existed his position for over 4 decades. And one of the things when my work with him was that he emphasized the importance of strategic culture. Now, strategic culture is very important to understanding a country and the mindset of the nation and peoples and their grand strategy. And so statecraft is a result, certainly, of strategic culture. Now, many of you may not, that may be a concept that you're not familiar with, but you may be familiar with that famous scene in the movie Pappin, where George C. Scott is in his home and he's suddenly getting attacked by a German Luftwaffe fighter, and he's sitting there and he runs out into the road, and he yells, shakes his hand, and he says, "Rommel, you son of a bitch, I read your book." And so that reflects a certain understanding of trying to understand the other nation's strategic culture. And so what that reflected was his understanding, or effort to understand, the mindset of Rommel. Now, I approached a similar approach today because of my efforts to try to look at Balázs Orbán's book on Hungarian strategy for connectivity. And so in his book, he's very prominently talking about the Hussar's Cut. And so the Hussar's Cut was a very fascinating part of kind of his book. And if I can just quote from it here, he said, and I think that this is important because the Hussar's Cut kind of reflects Hungarian grand strategy. And he says, the Hussar's Cut is the ethos of the Hudson virtues is the so-called Hussar's Cut. Any dictionary of the Hungarian language defines it as follows: a fast, decisive, surprising, and at times reckless enterprise, an initiative or action that risks everything. The hussar's success depends on whether there's an opportunity for a hussar's cut. And he recommends in this book, Hungary needs just such a maneuver. And he said that there are many unknown factors and the outcome of the game is very unpredictable. But smaller nations that want to take the destiny into their own hands have no choice. And so with that kind of background on multipolarity versus connectivity, certainly Hungary is opting for the hussar's cut here in terms of grand strategy. Hungary is, because it's newfound independence, it's still entering into the third decade of independence, but it's still trying to find its own identity and its new path in the world and grand strategy. And part of that has been this strategy of what he tried to identify in his book, which I was very, it was very important to me to understand kind of the mindset for understanding where Hungary is coming from. But what I wanted to title my presentation today was not the hussar's cut, but the hussar's paradox. Because to me, the hussar's paradox right now is Hungary's outlined a strategy where it's trying to develop this balancing act with Russia and China and the European Union while simultaneously being a member of NATO. So this kind of new balancing act is a form of what we call a hedging strategy, which some of my colleagues here have discussed. And so going forward, as this panel is supposed to talk about culture, economically, and militarily, is where will this kind of, how will this affect Hungary? Well, part of the problem in this hedging strategy is that Hungary's invested a lot in a time and effort when it's courted the efforts of Chinese investment, and it's certainly been trying to become a major interlocutor in ending the war in Ukraine. And also, as President Obama traveled to China and tried to enlist their support. But there's a certain element here to understanding where the whole grand strategy aspect is going, because as we sit here in Budapest, the elements of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire are still very much evident to me in the way I look at the way the grand strategy is being developed. Wes Mitchell wrote a book called The Grand Strategy of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It's a very lengthy book, and I encourage everyone here, if you get a chance to read it, but it goes into some of the faults of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and its grand strategy. And one of those, which is a lesson applicable to the United States, is that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire overextended its defense perimeter. And because it overextended its defense perimeter, it became very open to what we call imperial overstretch, that it became so overextended it couldn't defend some of these territories, and that ultimately affected the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So this is, to me, this is a problem now too with NATO, as a war is going on inside Ukraine, and Ukraine is trying to advocate for NATO membership, and I believe that NATO, and which Hungary is a member of, has to face a crossroads on what it's going to do with its defense strategy. Now, many people are saying that it's imperial overstretch, that it's stretched too far for NATO, but whereas there may be maybe a defensive strategy perimeter for NATO, there's also what I call a war-fighting perimeter. And that war-fighting perimeter is happening every day between Ukraine and Russia as they bomb each other's cities. And it's part of a project that I got on writing a book on the Black Sea and how how the Ukraine war is reinventing NATO's eastern flank. This is the war and is starting to affect how we think about this part. Caught me. Okay, great, thanks. So the war in Ukraine is rapidly affecting, as many of you have seen, in the war in the Black Sea. So with the Montreux Convention closure of the Black Sea to outside powers, what has happened is strategically is that the United States and its NATO allies started looking at the role played by the Danube. And now this is a role that can be relevant and very important to Hungary going forward, because we have a phrase in America where we say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And what unfortunately in your part of the world, what happens in the Carpathians doesn't always stay in the Carpathians. So it very much interconnects and affects Hungary's stability. And so as this war continues to unwind, there are certain elements that are very unpredictable, I think, for Hungary, for NATO, and for the United States, especially as it enters in its third year. So part of your hedging strategy has been very important, but there's also some elements that you may not be considering in Hungary's grand strategy. And one of those is that President Trump, if he's elected, becomes president again, he will try to make a deal with Putin. But at the same time, he may not get a deal. And what Hungarians need to keep in mind is that President Trump doesn't like to portray weakness. He likes to portray strength. And so he may try to get a deal, but if he doesn't get it, I think he will unleash a lot of things to help arm Ukraine that will help it moving forward, that will defy his critics. And if that happens, then Hungary needs to figure out how it's going to re-identify itself in the wake of a continuing war that's going on above in the Carpathians and Ukraine. And it may not be able to stay out of that. But how will Hungary come and offer itself to the United States and President Trump in this new environment? And what you developed in a hedging strategy has been, you've courted Chinese investment. That's great. They're going to build an electric battery plant here in Hungary. It's also caused some controversy. You've got the German companies are also coming in, and China's going to build a railroad from Budapest to Belgrade. They're investing $50 billion. But what happens if Trump comes in and he suddenly starts declaring drill, drill, drill on day one? And so the price of oil, as you're seeing now, is already dropping, $60 a barrel. So if the United States opens up its oil reserves, then the price of oil will go further. And the question here, and at the larger strategic level, is what happens to the price of oil, and how does it affect electrical cars? Well, people start abandoning electric cars. So Hungary's made this great investment and tried to understand and develop a coordinated China, but this strategy may find itself having to change that, especially if President Trump declares tariffs against China. So Hungary may have to go back and try to identify some of the things that it wants to do and redevelop this grand strategy, which it hasn't been careful about. And the key thing to realpolitik is always adjusting your strategy to adapt. You may talk about realpolitik, but what kind of realpolitik? Now, if you look at Turkey and what's happening with Turkey, they're canceling their agreement with Blue Stream gas pipeline. And so this week, they're signing major oil and gas agreements in Houston, Texas, with American LNG companies. So Turkey's hedging its strategy and temporarily pivoting another route because of its geographic strategic location. Hungary needs to also consider this. Hungary hasn't opted out of buying the F-16s, for example. It bought the Gripen fighters from Sweden. Maybe Hungary needs to go back and reconsider Lockheed Martin and buying F-16s. That would certainly be very appealing to President Trump. So as we're talking about this war-fighting perimeter, the changes that are occurring, hedging strategies, it's very important to kind of going forward, as they say in his book, in Balazs's book, he talks about you have to build on your own strengths. And he says you have to climb your own ladder. That's great advice. I think it should be applauded, but sometimes you're going to have to be ready to climb down from that ladder. And so you don't know what's going to happen with President Trump, and hopefully if the elections go in a different direction, as John Lund pointed out this morning, Plan B with Kamala Harris doesn't look very good for Hungary. So Hungary also needs a hedging strategy against that as well. So I think that this is very important overall strategically to kind of point this out. There's a very important role to be played with the Danube and Hungary. There's a place called Coleman Barracks in Mannheim, and it sits on the Rhine River. And the United States has built a huge forward deployment depot of armored equipment and U.S. military personnel. And those military personnel with the Montreux Convention has closed off the Bosphorus. So the Danube has now become and will become a very important strategic artery for the United States. So it's important to think about ways to develop a grand strategy to try to help the United States in this effort. And maybe there's a role going forward for Hungary in a new form of NATO. The whole geopolitical imprint of NATO is moving east, and we need to get over that. It's no longer in Ramstein. You know, the new Ramstein of the East is an MK Air Base in Romania. Oh, cut me off.
I'm getting used to this.
So this will be my final. But so from Budapest to the Black Sea, it's nearly 1,600 kilometers. So this type of aspect, and the Danube goes through Austria. There's certain roles to be played by Austria. But so I hope that as Hungary is climbing its ladder, that it will keep these things in mind. There's a great book by Victor Sebastian called Budapest, Portrait of a City Between East and West. And in the opening pages of that book, Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich was standing there talking to someone, and he was pointing to Hungary. And he said, the eminent Habsburg statesman pointed his finger to the road to Hungary. And he said, that's where Europe ends, somewhere out there, pointing at Hungary. And he says, there is the Orient. And I think for Hungary, it is very important to point to the United States, to help the United States identify what is out there, and point out that there's places like the Organization of Turkic States, that Hungary is an observer mission. And next time Orbán meets with President Trump, he said, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, I think you guys ought to be an observer to the Organization of Turkic States. Because it's a market. And Trump thinks in terms of markets and economy. And so it's not just the European Union, but it's alternative markets for American goods. So ultimately, Europe is out there, Hungary's here, point the way to the Orient. And that's my recommendations. Thank you for letting me speak.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Gladden Pappin, President of the Hungarian Institute of National Affairs.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you to the organizers and to everyone for coming this afternoon. I also want to thank Glen for de facto authorizing me to sit down in sequence if I wish to, but I'm going to follow the implicit law of the panel and stand up for a few minutes. So I want to make a few points about the situation of the United States. And I think that I'm an American who's been living in Budapest for a few years, and looking back across the ocean, as I've been doing in the last couple of months, suggests that things are not well. And needless to say, I think, although I haven't checked my phone, thus far I have not received any information that President Trump has suffered an assassination attempt today, but clearly the day is not over yet. In America, so the things are heating up, or something is happening. And one thing that I'm pretty certain is that in the last few years in the U.S., there have not been enough panels like this, not enough panels devoted to analyzing the potential scenarios that are coming up in the world order, whether it's going to remain unipolar or have a form of bipolarity, or shallow or deep multipolarity, and what the right strategies are for the U.S. for that. But I think the problem is actually deeper at the moment, which is that in the United States, for now, as things currently stand, it's not well situated for navigating a new form of world order. And that's because it's very, very heavily invested in the form of world order that it has participated in for the last 30 years. Now, this is not to say that the U.S. doesn't have extraordinary resources for being able to navigate the upcoming world order. I'm constantly asked things like, is the U.S. on the verge of civil war? And my stock reply is like, well, you know, it's a really big country, and when all the conservatives got sick of living with liberals in California, it's like Pareto optimal that they moved to Texas, and then people are happier in California and happier in Texas, and they're not about to have a civil war. Multiple assassination attempts on the former president might call this into question, but the U.S. has a lot of resources for being able to reinvent itself and to change things in its domestic arrangement in order to survive and to continue. It's obviously very industrially strong, very creative, has an enormous, extremely rich economy, and still the most powerful military. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the situation that we're seeing in the set of possible emergent futures is that these elements of the American package that was offered in the 1990s and the early 2000s, the ideological element, the economic element, the military element, and the political element, each one of them is kind of on shaky ground, and they all don't go together so clearly as a package as they once did. So it's pretty easy to make a kind of ideological critique of the form of liberal polity that the U.S. is currently displaying. But in the 1990s, the idea was that the new unipolar hegemon, which had emerged out of the ashes or the conclusion of the Cold War, had a synthesized package to offer the rest of the world as its path to development, to peaceful cooperation, and to participation in the new globalized world. This was basically a set of economic advantages which would come from participation in the new globalized system, following the rules that were set by the Washington Consensus and deployed through a lot of international institutions. Militarily, it was basically like the U.S. will take care of you, and it will take care of you by eliminating the minor threats that come up here and there, the occasional Saddam Hussein, that sort of thing, 15-day air war, get it over with. Politically, it will offer you the recipe that you need to make yourself strong in the same way, and that's the set of liberal democratic institutions that were baked in the U.S. and offered elsewhere in the world. So it was offered immediately to Middle Eastern countries that were conquered, for example. And the sign of success is having the little purple mark on the tip of your finger that showed that you voted, and this was a sign that things were on the right track. And then finally, ideologically and culturally, there would be a need for the birth of a spirit of basically liberal individualism. This would enable people to become creative and to participate in the new economy which this whole system was putting forth. Well, over the last 20 years, it's pretty clear that these four elements have fallen out of whack. It's clearly possible to have successful countries outside of the West that have a more conservative basis. The West has abandoned in many respects, its core industrial capacities, allowed those to go elsewhere. The political system, again, if we're to judge on the basis of these sorts of assassination attempts and the kind of complete, trying not to use the word polarization, but the complete politicization of everything in the U.S. now, this seems like it's a system which is having more and more difficulty coming to a consensus and deciding on how it will proceed in the world. So this is kind of the elements of the situation. And if we look outside of the U.S., what we would find is that in the rest of the world, the beginnings of this shift to a multipolar world mean that the different elements that I described, ideological, economic, military, and political, are being packaged by different powers in different ways that are suitable to them. And so as Damjan mentioned earlier, there has been a kind of decline in understanding of economic statecraft in the West. Again, the economic recipe that we put forward in the 1990s was, minimize state direction of the economy, minimize strategic decisions about what an economy should include within it, and let the globalized laws of the market, carry industry and consumers wherever they want. And the result of that has been, economic desolation in large parts of the U.S., political alienation, people feeling that they're not part of a unified culture. And at the same time, it's pretty clear that in whatever form of world order we wind up in a few years, industrial power and economic strength are going to be a key part of it. So one metric you could look at in order to conclude that something is happening is that at least on a purchasing power adjusted basis, the BRICS plus countries as a whole are as large as the Western alliance combined. So even though the BRICS plus countries don't share a polity and don't share a unified foreign policy, still there's something that relates them together, and altogether they have an enormous economic strength that is being driven by numerous members within the BRICS investing in each other, building projects, thinking about Belt and Road, and it's been very difficult for the U.S. to come up with a response to that. In the Trump administration, there was an attempt to transform the nature of America's overseas investment. There had been the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which was a program of the U.S. government to support through loans American private companies that happened to be operating overseas or building things overseas. And there was an effort kind of inspired by the Belt and Road Initiative or by Belt and Road Envy or something like that, to come up with a replacement or an American alternative. This involved the transforming of OPIC into the Development Finance Corporation, which was supposed to make equity investments alongside American private companies that were operating overseas. But if we were just to evaluate this kind of tactic or this shift, it's a pretty small maneuver on the U.S.'s part compared to the massive structure of the Belt and Road Initiative, the massive power of China to project its economic strength, to use regional countries or countries in its region as parts of its churning economic strength. That's something that doesn't seem to be existing in the American mindset at the moment. And there's no indication that it's about to. On a military basis, again, I don't think we need to, I need to make a long presentation, and I'm not a specialist in military analysis, but obviously over the last 25 years, the U.S. has been challenged a lot in its assumption that it can manage multiple conflicts and multiple theaters at the same time and come out relatively the clear victor in each one. That's being challenged even today as its Ukraine effort has stumbled and it's having difficulty prioritizing or choosing which area of its focus to look at. At the same time, the areas of U.S. interests that have been a core part of its alliance, the NATO alliance in Europe, the nature of that relationship has also changed a lot in the last few years. The U.S. has basically dictated a foreign policy to Europe when it comes to the Ukraine war, which has led to Europe becoming facing the beginnings of deindustrialization through super high energy prices. Why is it rational for the U.S. to effectively bring low one of its principal trading partners and principal allies through encouraging an energy policy on them, which results in the ruination of their economies? Why is this rational? So the problem is not even that the decisions that are being made are wrong or mistaken. It's that at the moment, unless we get a Trump administration in which there's a much more practical and deal-making approach, and unless it has the ability to transform the American foreign policy stance from within, unless we get those things at a minimum, there's no indication that this shift in mindset is coming. And so, although as a conservative growing up in America, I was always kind of irritated by calls for dialogue and discussion and diversity and things like that. At the moment in the Western discourse, there's so few examples of panels and discussions around topics such as this, that in order for the West to clearly formulate a strategy of how to navigate the emergent, whatever shallow or deep multipolar world, we will indeed need to have many, many more discussions and much more extensive analyses of the diversity of political forms and geopolitical strategies that are being deployed by, well, more and more countries throughout the world, not just Hungary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Pappin. Kind of in an awkward situation here since we have 10 minutes or so. My apologies. This is a very interesting topic. We can go on all day. So I'll only try to squeeze in one question. I'll try to basically capture the entire spirit of this discussion in one question. So bear with me. This is a bit of a challenge. As Balázs Orbán alluded to this morning, and we've seen this as a themed discussion, the probable desired outcome of a multipolar era is balance of power between the great powers. And the key question we keep on coming back to one way or another is, does connectivity play a role in building that stability? And if so, what is the role of smaller states, keystone states, middle powers, countries like Hungary in achieving that? And this is an open-ended question, so if anyone wants to take a whack at it, all yours.
Well, obviously the smaller states have a very pivotal role in this, because without the smaller states, it'll really be the usual unipolar world or something variant or something near about that. The question about whether the strategic choices for Hungary is as nominal as it's sometimes made out to be is not something I find very persuasive. The problem with Hungary is, firstly, it's tied within the European Union structure, and the impulses of the EU as towards a federal Europe, with greater number of at least Germany and France at one point making attempts to sort of control the foreign policy and other policies of the thing, which would naturally constrict the elbow room for Hungary. At the same time, there are pressures from below in almost every single European Union member state for a more democratic, less bureaucratic approach to what the EU should be. If those impulses actually start shaping the future of the dispensation in Brussels, there will be many more opportunities for countries such as Hungary. But I think the key to it lies not by any unilateral move of Hungary, but to what extent it is backed up by other countries. How much does Croatia play a role? How much does Slovakia play a role? Does Poland revert to its earlier government's position? Does the pressures in France and Germany, do they shape things? So it's not something which I would say can be discounted easily, but it's not immediately apparent. It's still work in progress, and it's serious. And everything else in the world will also play a role in influencing that, including what's happening in the Silk Road, etc. These are things. As far as China is concerned, I think sometimes we attribute too much of Confucian wisdom to the present regime in China, which is not always the case. Sometimes they can be a bit pig-headed in their approach, and it's not as subtle and sophisticated as it sometimes seems. And whether China is going to be ultimately responsible for some of the strategic blunders which the Austro-Hungarian Empire was guilty of overextension, is also something we need to watch out. My own feeling is that China is, to use Mao's things, not entirely not a paper tiger.
let's use the precious remaining time then to ask audience questions, since I don't want to deny you.
Hello, everybody. This is Ali Iqbali, Institute for Political and International Studies, Islamic Republic of Iran. I benefit these conferences, and actually regarding this panel, I would like to ask the panelists regarding, of course, the aim and goal of all us is to have peace, justice, stability, and of course, right of making decision. How can succeed or to have success the multipolarity without to create or to guarantee a kind of balances for all country? If we come back to the important or major crisis of the world in 2 days' life, we can mention Gaza crisis, Ukraine crisis, and of course the new power in Afghanistan. How can multipolarity to succeed to create some kind of peace, stability, and of course the major right of every country, like sovereignty, integrity, and all of that. Thank you.
Well, I won't be able to offer a pat answer to the question, but I would just say that we should make sure that we distinguish between descriptions of the world situation, goals, and strategies. And then we can ask questions about the three of them. But I think multipolarity is a potential description of the situation, and we could ask whether, as we understand it, if the actors who are participating within it are likelier to make choices that lead to a better or worse situation. Many powers might feel threatened or isolated, or maybe the institutions that would help them navigate a multipolar world don't exist, or the institutions could be oriented toward a previous system. That's how I see kind of the overall thing. Multipolarity is not a strategy, but some kind of description of the world. And so within that, the question is, what strategies should we follow if we want to see a peaceful version of that world? And I think that's where I will prescind from giving a universal answer to the question. But clearly, there were forms of connectivity, if you consider liberal globalization to be one, which ultimately led to backlash and collapse. So connectivity was the word of the day in the 1990s in the liberal version of globalization, but that system also included a number of principles like nations don't matter, doesn't matter where things are made, traditions and cultures are things of the past, and by allowing those aspects to fester or even to dominate, the system ended up causing a catastrophic reaction against it. So it's probably too much to hope for a world in which all states feel secure and are also well connected in different ways and protect their national interests. But if there is something to hope for, it would be that as more states begin to hedge, they will also have to relate to one another, not relate to one another on different planes. So there will be some aspects that depend on military alliance and others that depend upon economic alliance. And hopefully out of that will come something other than a global conflagration.
Thank you. I was thinking as you were asking this question, there's a fellow named Evan Feigenbaum at I forget where he is, but anyway, he used to work for the United States government. He has this great line. It's increasingly about addition and multiplication and not about subtraction and division, right? You get more or you seek more from more. And that really, if you think of connectivity in that sense, right, that actually could be, this is my way of trying to answer your question. But at the same time, this should be contrasted with something else, and that is, this idea that somehow your concept of justice should prevail every time. Aristotle calls that the definition of tragedy. And so if you bring in the concept of justice and you put that together with the concept of connectivity, that, I think, is going to be a walk down the wrong road. But if we think of connectivity as emphasizing addition and multiplication, and understanding that particularly keystone states or middle powers or whatever could be sort of the fabric that brings regions and geopolitical theaters together, then yes, that can be genuinely beneficial. But if we start throwing our own moral concepts into this, that are essentially particular concepts, but that all of us try to universalize, then that's a zero-sum equation, and that is sort of the antithesis of the concept of connectivity.
Right. Now, technically, we're now on time to finish, but should we sneak in one more question, or?
Briefly, yes.
Briefly, all right. Gentleman up there has been kind of waiting to start.
Thank you. In a multipolar and connected world, we can use the historical wisdom and experience of different countries to solve conflicts. If we see the Ukrainian-Russian war, it's a war on the ruins of an empire for the heritage with the patterns of civil war. Can, from the Indian point of view, use the history of the Indian-Pakistan wars to give some new perspective to it, and as a strategic power of India, can be a honest broker to solve this war?
Well, I'm not terribly sure whether the analogy holds, but one of the facets of connectivity, which is really quite important, which I beg to disagree with one of the fellow panelists, is that I think the mere fact that a country or countries have a established grievance does not necessarily negate the quest for multipolarity. China, for instance, is a country which has a very deep-seated grievance. Hungary is a country which has a grievance. And we all know what the grievance is. You can say that the grievance might be traced back to 1918. Likewise, in India, there exists both a grievance and an acceptance of that. So there's an ongoing debate as to whether the partition of India was inimical to the country, that it would have been better off had it been a united India, whose civilizational reach started from Kandahar and went down to sort of maybe Singapore, which is a sort of Lord Curzon's sort of view of the whole thing. And then there are others who believe that actually the truncation of India has made for its cohesiveness and has enabled it to find a role for itself, which has enabled it to climb to about number 3 in the World Economic League. That climb upwards. Previously, what was said about India was that here is a country with a great deal of potential. And now, when we see some of that potential being realized, would that have been possible with the grievance or minus the grievance? And the Ukraine, without going into the larger issue, there seems to be that Russia has a very deep-seated historical grievance about the loss, about a loss. And how that will play out, that's not, it's another question altogether. Another a debate subject altogether.
I know what you're alluding to, and I would come up with a different analogy. I look at Russia and Ukraine as two Slavic titans that are slugging it out. And when you look at what Rheinmetall is transferring to Ukraine to help develop its arms industry, and a country like Ukraine, it had thousands of nuclear weapons and strategic missiles that it gave back to Russia as a part of the Budapest Memorandum. I foresee a long, very bloody, protracted conflict on the edge of Europe. And India, Pakistan, what you're alluding to, is also kind of a long, protracted conflict between two states. But it's a different contrast because of Ukraine is getting, the industrial potential of what exists, which is limited, but it exists from the West. And it's developing its own weapons industry, its own fleet of naval drones that are revolutionizing warfare and changing the way that the navies fight in the Black Sea. So this stuff is not going to end anytime soon, I think.
And now we are really over time, so I would like to thank my fellow panelists, the audience, everyone, and I think now comes the coffee break, or...
Good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone. So we're on the final panel of the day, although afterwards we have a closing discussion later from 5:15. But this is our last full panel of the day. And I'll just give you the title and the name of our moderator. So the title of this panel is The Future of Energy, Green Dreams versus Real Needs. And our moderator today is Logan West, who I basically first met in Iraq, actually, last year. Interesting place to meet someone for the first time. But Logan West, who's a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute. Logan, take it away.
Thank you, Kellum. And once again, I want to welcome everybody to our final panel for the day, the focus will be on energy. Today, the discussion and impact of energy policy, both at the national and international levels, is one that is heated, to say the least. There are many factors contributing to discussion around how such policy is formulated. The question of utilizing renewables, such as solar and wind, or non-renewables, such as oil and gas, and their impacts, are a heated debate both in the halls of government and in academia. Efforts by the European Union to decouple from Russian energy sources over their invasion of Ukraine have sparked heated talk about whether it is ideology or realism that should drive foreign policy formulation. And finally, the development of new alliances, such as Hungary's latest new connections to Azerbaijan and Georgia, have raised questions about what the future of energy policy formulation should look like. Indeed, the realm of energy affairs is one that is challenged with a multitude of complexities and factors. The man who will deliver our keynote is someone who has had notable success in navigating this realm. Mr. Brigham McCown is a senior fellow and director of the Initiative on American Energy Security at Hudson Institute. And in the world of energy infrastructure, he has been responsible for running one of the world's most complex systems, that of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, an 800-mile line that stretches from the northern coast of Alaska to the south and delivers roughly 500,000 barrels of oil a day. Mr. McCown's 3 decades of domestic and foreign policy experience while serving in key positions within industry, government, and the U.S. military, no doubt have provided him a strong foundation for this great success. Now, we hope he will share his experience with us to understand what the keys to success are in the industry. Mr. Cowan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Logan. That's a very kind introduction. And colleagues, friends, guests, I'm honored to be here with you today. It's a beautiful setting and a beautiful city, and I don't need much encouragement to travel to Budapest. I'd like to thank the organizers for the fourth summit here in Budapest, and I think it's through these exchanges that we can identify and address important policy challenges facing us. This talk will be a little bit of a scene setter for the rest of the panel, and I think it's important to note at the outset that modern living standards are made possible by affordable access to energy. Right? For the billions of people without that access, even the most basic tasks can be extremely challenging. And as we look into the future, we can see that the global population is going to continue to increase. As the population rises, so too does the need for additional sources of energy. I may have just, oh, there it's back. Whether it's in farming, industry, or everyday life, we require energy. Energy to lift ourselves out of poverty and to improve our overall quality of life. Energy is, therefore, the lifeblood of the economy. Here are a couple universal truths. Throughout human history, we have always consumed more energy, not less. Energy transitions do indeed occur, but traditionally they occur over a much broader and longer period of time than most people would forecast. Up until now, we've always transitioned to denser fuel sources, meaning that as we transition to a new fuel that releases more energy than the fuel it replaces. This point is important given that today we still have 4 billion people below what is considered the modern energy minimum. Indeed, we have always sought to squeeze more work from energy, and prior energy transitions have allowed us to exponentially increase the use of energy. For much of human history, energy sources were largely biomass-based. Wood, peat, animal dung even provided the bulk of the energy needed to support early societies. However, these communities grew and evolved. The need for more reliable and powerful energy sources became evident. The agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, you didn't think we'd talk agriculture and energy, but it marked another turning point. The ability to cultivate crops, domesticate animals, was at its core an energy breakthrough. By harnessing animals for labor and harnessing natural flows for irrigation, early civilization unlocked new ways to supply and multiply human effort. Energy in these early forms allowed societies to store surplus food, support larger populations, and build cities and states. But it was the Industrial Revolution that truly transformed the way we think about energy and its role in society. The discovery and widespread use of coal, followed by oil and natural gas, brought about this seismic shift. These fuels provided unprecedented amounts of concentrated energy, which would power the machines that would fuel industrial growth. The ability to harness denser sources of energy launched us into an area of rapid technological progress, marked by mass production, urbanization, and modern transportation. We also ushered in the atomic age by harnessing fission reaction for peaceful production of electricity. And in the future, breakthroughs in fusion could be even more transformative. Energy is much more than just a physical source. It's in fact the foundation upon which economies are built. Energy facilitates the manufacturing of goods, the movement of people and resources, and the very functioning of modern society. Without it, economic structures that define our contemporary world would collapse. One of the most critical contributions that energy has made to humanity is its direct correlation to economic growth. We can observe how the availability of energy has been directly tied to the prosperity of nations. Energy-rich societies can produce more, transport goods further, and innovate faster than energy-poor counterparts. The rise of the British Empire in the 19th century was in large part due to the early and effective use of coal during the Industrial Revolution. The economic might of the United States in the 20th century was built on abundant supplies of oil and natural gas. Even today, the shale revolution has seen unprecedented growth of energy production. Thanks to the ability to extract oil and gas from shale, the U.S. is now the world's top oil producer and the top gas producer. Some might even say that's despite certain political positions of parties in power. Our economies rely on energy to function. So whether it's powering factories, lighting homes, or running complex digital networks, the demand for reliable and affordable energy is continuous and unwavering. When energy becomes scarce, it is not only the economy that suffers, but society itself is at risk. We should therefore be focused on policies that cultivate energy abundance, not energy scarcity. This brings me to the vital intersection of energy and national security. Throughout history, access to energy has been a critical factor in determining the power dynamics between nations. The ability to secure energy resources has been central to the rise and fall of empires, and it remains the cornerstone of global politics today. Energy security, as we know, refers to the availability of reliable and affordable energy sources for national consumption without significant interruptions. It encompasses the stable supply of energy resources, the resilience of energy infrastructure, and the ability of a country to meet its current and future energy demands while also dealing with emergencies, natural disasters, and geopolitical tensions that could disrupt supply. Stated more plainly, I've distilled energy security into this definition: uninterruptible energy at an affordable price, period. That's it. Objective terms devoid of subjective political and social narratives. Energy security really focuses on two main points: short-term security, which is the ability to promptly react to sudden changes of the supply-demand balance, and long-term energy security, which requires investments in supply infrastructure that align with economic developments and environmental needs. With this understanding, we can clearly see that energy security underpins both domestic and national security. Wars have been fought, alliances forged, and entire regions destabilized over the control of energy resources. Energy security is not just a matter of military capability and geopolitical strategy. It is a matter of economic resilience. The ability of nations to secure a stable and affordable energy supply has direct implications for the prosperity and well-being of their citizens. America found that out after the 1973 Arab oil embargo. After all, the United States had provided more than 75% of all the oil used for allies during World War II, only to become dependent some decades later on foreign oil. These are policy choices with dramatic ramifications. In a similar fashion today, we run the risk of being beholden to supply chains controlled by others in the renewable energy markets. Overall, this concept rings especially true in today's interconnected and energy-dependent world. The more a nation relies on imports from unstable regions, the more vulnerable it becomes to disruptions of supplies. As energy demand continues to grow, ensuring stable access to energy resources will be paramount for maintaining not only economic stability, but also national sovereignty. Where natural resources are absent, alliances are more important today than ever. As I mentioned earlier, we consume more energy today than ever before. Coal's premature death has been suggested for years, yet the world will use more coal in 2024 than in any other previous year. This is not to say that transitions don't occur, but we should be leading in these areas. The reality is that perhaps we should shift the paradigm just a bit and reevaluate this from a slightly different point of view. Are we really in the midst of an energy transition? Or would it be more accurate to suggest that we're in the midst of an unprecedented time, a period of energy expansion. While the West, or at least parts of it, tend to look inward when evaluating policy truth, the reality is that we only need to look to China, India, and the global South to see this notion. If we look closer to home, we also see future demands on the horizon, especially being driven by data, computer power, and the growth of artificial intelligence. Speaking of the West, I think it's critical that we better understand what has happened in Europe, where policies have constrained GDP. Nowhere is this more evident than in certain countries' societal and economic policies that have become quite damaging since 2022. While not completely the underlying reason, energy or the lack thereof has been front and center during this period. We must rethink how we leverage energy markets to our advantage, not to our own detriment. For a millennia, energy has been at the heart of human progress. It's driven the growth of civilizations, fostered technological advancements, and provided the very foundation of our society. We find ourselves at a critical juncture. As energy demand continues to rise, driven by population growth and industrial expansion, the need for reliable and affordable energy has never been more urgent. This energy landscape is also becoming increasingly complex, with new technologies and geopolitical dynamics shaping how we produce, distribute, and consume that. That said, we can ill afford to become distracted by policies which undermine our energy security at a time where universal international agreements remain largely aspirational, and where we risk unilateral economic disarmament by embracing intermittent and more expensive energy options, while other countries unabashedly continue to invest in cheaper alternatives. From an industrial point, we have to keep in mind that raw materials plus energy and labor equal competitive cost. This magic mix determines our own competitiveness on the global markets. In conclusion, the transformation of energy systems is not something that happens overnight, nor even perhaps in decades, as policymakers must consider that these timeframes require careful consideration of technological, economic, and environmental factors. We must recognize that energy transitions, no matter how necessary, are slow, a difficult process. The world can simply not flip a switch and replace entrenched energy systems without significant economic and societal impacts. It is our responsibility, therefore, to ensure that these transitions are handled in a way that maintains stability and security while also meeting our growing energy needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McCown, for your opening remarks. Our first panelist I would like to introduce is Dr. Sarah Vakshori. Professor Vakshori is a professor at the Institute of World Politics, which is my alma mater, on energy security, and she is also the director for the Center for Energy and Security and Diplomacy at the same institute. She is also the founder and president of SVB Energy International, an energy consultancy firm that has a history of working in the region. Professor Vakshori.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers for such opportunity. Being in the last panel has the advantage of hearing everybody, and I would kind of summarize what I want to say in key points. It was just mentioned by our keynote speaker, the definition of energy security, which is uninterrupted supply of energy. I would like to add one component to that and propose the energy trilemma, as we are discussing today, that not only the energy should be uninterrupted and secure supplies, it should be affordable, obviously, because it has a close connection to our national security, economy, food security, and overall defense and daily life. Definitely, the third aspect is sustainability and also responsibility. So we need a secure, affordable, but also responsible source of energy. However, the responsibility and sustainability should not necessarily be interpreted by certain types of energy. We cannot necessarily argue that only green energy is the sustainable or responsible source of energy. Moving from energy trilemma and looking into energy and national security, I'm by training an energy strategist. I train energy strategists, and I had the honor of working with the U.S. government and multiple countries on their energy strategy. And the first thing that we consider is the view of that country, where that country is located, what are the sources of that country. So definitely energy security and energy strategy is changing from one view to the other view. And if I would like to refer to Hungary, which it's one of the first countries in the world back in 2020 to legally commit to produce a responsible energy, to look into carbon neutrality. What this morning the advisor to the Prime Minister mentioned kind of set a key scene for the fundamentals of the energy strategy for this country, and that's economic neutrality. You need to have multiple suppliers, multiple sources that you're obviously using and tapping into that. It's very important. And it's very interesting because the notion of energy security, since Churchill, which historically, when we go back, is the time that he decides to change the fuel of British Navy from local coal to the whales to the oil that at that time was coming from Persia, he kind of connected the outcome of the war that he was engaged with the security of the resources. Churchill's solution at that time for the energy security of country was diversification. So to this day, as an energy strategist, when we look at the country and we try to create resiliency and security within an energy system, we look into diversification, not just the diversification of supplies, but resources too. If we look at only limited types of resources, we would definitely create lack of flexibility in our system. It was just maybe a week ago that Italian energy minister called green an ideology. And again, this morning we discussed a lot about emotions, pragmatic, ideology. I personally believe we need all sources of energy because of the sheer expansion of demand. And the monster in the room, I would call it monster, not the elephant, is the data centers and AI. Why? Because we have absolutely no idea. I like to repeat myself. We have no idea how the demand for these two are increasing. In a traditional forecasting models, when we look at the energy forecast, we look at two factors, and was mentioned by our keynote speaker, population and economic growth or industrial growth. Until this day, I raised this issue 2 years ago that we were sitting in a room with major data forecasting companies from BP to EIA, IEA, Capstack, everybody. And I'm like, which of you have a model to forecast the energy needs of AI and data centers? Until this day, no one has, because the growth of AI is exponential. If you follow ChatGPT, for instance, in the past year, the speed of it, the processing of that has been exponentially increased. The only thing that we know in the United States, for me to get an answer to that question was to talking to the power generation companies in North Virginia, where 70% of global internet traffic is passing. So when I talk to electricity distributors and suppliers, I told them, okay, we in a market don't know how much energy we need, but you are the one who you have contract with data centers and everybody to supply electricity. How much do you know you have to produce? The result and answer was scary. Just for North Virginia, just for data centers, this does not include AI, just the data centers in North Virginia, only the data centers that these electricity companies have contracts with them, we in the United States need additional 24 gigawatts of energy by 2038. How much that is, if I want to put it in a perspective, for just electricity supplies in North Virginia, we would need about 26 to 30 nuclear power plants, additional. So when we are dealing with such monster, we do not have a luxury of deducting sources of energy that could be often efficient from region to region. We saw after the Ukraine-Russia conflict that the prices of all sources of energy increased, but coal was like skyrocketing. Why? Because coal is local to many countries, and coal demand increased significantly. The only thing that we are focused and fixated now is carbon. But is carbon important or color? You know, are we trying to mitigate the carbon, or we are trying to be fixated on color? And what about other emissions? Methane. So if a country uses its own domestic domestic coal reserves and produces a certain amount of emissions, is that more harmful to environment, or if we bring in natural gas from one country to the other country and have methane emissions, which no one is actually calculating yet, and methane is more destructive. So what is important to reduce those judgments and look at the specific plan that we could have. However, it's very important, while we're looking at different sources of energy, we could have solar panels all over Germany with high efficiency. But if you only get 30% sun, your outcome from those power generation is only 30%. If you put the same solar panels in Oman or Saudi Arabia, you might get 80%. But nuclear power plant, coal, or fossil fuels, they give you the yield that your power plant is. So it's very important to maintain your base load, obviously, based on a source of energy that is reliable in compared to other ones. But we see countries like Saudi Arabia, which has an abundance of fossil fuel, is still investing in renewables because you want that diversification. And, okay, I talked on diversification of resources, and I know it's 5 minutes, Logan. So I just briefly talking about diversification of suppliers. I think we need to tap in and have access as a country to multiple suppliers. And me being from US, and the shale oil was mentioned, one of the blessings of shale oil for the oil market was the transportation route. Majority of oil passes through certain choke points that are prone to strategic and geopolitical threat. The US shale oil and gas passes through different sides of the world, which obviously creates diversification. The other factor in US is that most of the investment in resources and technology is within the hands of private companies, which kind of, ironically, is a perfect insurance for the swing in policy and politics in the United States. We are currently have an administration who started its campaign by ban on fracking, and ironically, we had a peak oil production in his administration. I don't give him any credit for that. I don't think it was President Biden that he promoted or induced this production. Why this happened? Because our companies know their business, number one. They invest where there's money. Number two is that the land in US and most of our resources are in private lands. So having access to US technologies and US companies gives a certain insurance, not just from the roots, but also the type of investment, technologies and investment. Looking into nuclear, which we talk a lot about it, obviously no one can challenge the fact that not just the strategic minerals, but uranium mines, if we look at them, most of them are under concession agreement with China in the world. A majority of the nuclear fuel is processed by Russia. So if we want to do the easy economic math, put at the electricity prices that has been produced in a Russian nuclear reactor, compared with the American one, and the French one, well, obviously, no one can beat the Russian prices. And there's a difference between American and the different price between American power prices and the Russian, and the French one is the highest. But here, there is something important to consider, and that's the marriage between who is investing and building that power plant. It's a long-term commitment. So I would look, and I would, again, like looking at a Hungarian perspective, you know, because I cannot come from US, have my own lens and look at it. Having diversified suppliers is obviously very important because the security of information, the security of supply, and the last thing one country wants is one country has the investment and has the power on the electricity production in that country. If tomorrow Russia decides that the fuel that is going to those reactors, the prices are not affordable, or the technology or technical assistance is not going, that is the direct production that goes to the end users, and it's the national security of the country. So again, going back and wrapping up, I think not only we need diversification of the supply sources, we do not want to push everybody away from fossil fuel to renewables that are sourced from minerals that are mainly owned or processed in or by China or limited countries. We do not want to take that flexibility from ourselves, but also the suppliers, the technology, and when that energy is coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Up next, I would like to introduce Dr. Ralph Scholhammer, visiting fellow at MCC and an adjunct professor of political science at Webster Vienna Private University. Professor.
Thanks so much. Thanks. All right, I promised I'm going to keep myself to 5 minutes, so I'm literally, metaphorically trying to steamroll everything I have to say onto you as quickly as I can. The first thing I want to say is we very often hear about the role of energy for the economy. Forget all about this. Energy is not just important for the economy, energy is life, quite literally. Right? The problem of us as a species is a very simple one. We are very weak. Like, if it's too cold, we die. If it's too hot, we die. Like, we're very sensitive. We're not as well equipped as many animals. The reason why, as a human species, we are dominant on this planet is because we found ways to transform energies in ways that allow us to live on almost every place on this earth. And if we have energy, we can do this. And I want to make this very clear. I want to tell you about the one successful energy transition that I find is the most fascinating one that nobody talks about. And that's a transition from slavery to the steam engine. We hear many stories about why slavery was abolished, why slavery no longer exists. And yes, there's a moral component to it. There's a philosophical component to it. We also heard today absolutely correctly, right, that wood, dung, like sources of energy. But ultimately, slavery was a force of energy, right? If you go back historically, even the ancient Greeks, the Romans, there was always kind of an aftertaste of slavery. They knew that something didn't feel right about it. But it was a necessary energy source for them to be a civilization, so they kept it. It was not until we found new, more efficient energy sources, like coal and then the steam engine, that allowed us to ultimately abandon slavery. If you think it's a coincidence that the country that discovered, or made, let's put it this way, made the steam engine commercially available, the British, were also the first ones to turn against slavery. Well, I guess the saying is that I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell to you. There's a direct connection about this. And it makes a lot of sense. I give another quick number. I find these numbers always fascinating. In 1870, the British steam engines produced as much labor, as much energy, as 40 million men. Now, the fun part is, at the time in Britain, in 1870, only 28 million men lived in Britain. In order to have those 40 million men, if they wouldn't have had the steam engine, they would have needed 3 times the yearly wheat output that Britain was producing. So in every respect, right, what the steam engine allowed us to do made human labor, manual labor, it made it more efficient in many ways, but it made it also gradually less necessary, at least forced human labor. Let me give you another example. And I know it's very late, so I want to make this more exciting, and so I talk about the most exciting thing in the room, which is you. Everybody in this room is a thinker, an advisor, a consultant, a professor, or as I call myself, a commentator on everything, right? I don't know much, but I have an opinion on everything. And the reason why I can do this is a very simple one, right? Because out there are millions and millions of machines that do the labor that otherwise we would have to do manually. We very often talk about, and I'm glad we do, about barrels of oil. But just to give you a number, kind of to make this more graspable, the work, the energy contained in 1 barrel of crude oil is the same kind of labor a man, unfortunately, apparently energy economics are still very sexist, don't ask me why, is the same amount of labor that a man could do in 4.5 years. Right? That's in 1 barrel of oil. Now, every year, and these are just hydrocarbons, I'm just talking about fossil fuels now. Every year the world, the numbers are from 2018, so they're slightly higher now, we use about 110 billion barrels of oil as an energy equivalent. Now, if you do the math, that's an army of workers that is almost 500 billion men. Right? This is what energy does to us. So we don't have 8 billion people live on this planet, but we have 500 billion laborers, if you want, our machines, doing work for us. And this brings me back also to the economy point. Because if you pursue an economic policy that reduces energy, if you reduce that quote-unquote machine army, somebody has to pick up that labor. Because here's a dirty secret. Once you get used to a certain living standard, you really don't want to give it up. Right? You really don't want to give it up. And if I'd say, for example, to you, you can no longer use your dishwasher. You can no longer use your dryer. You'll say, all right, then I'll find somebody who does it manually for me. And we have a very clear correlation. The places in the world where slavery or slavery-like conditions are still common are all these areas where there is lack of access to energy. So none of this is pure fantasy because, as I said, people want higher living standards. They want others to work for them. We figured out the best way to do is machinery. If that machinery will disappear, what's going to happen is we will replace it again with human labor. How many minutes do you have left? Okay, excellent. Now, when I talk about these 500 billion, right, the important thing is what we have to look at now is the distribution of those 500 billion, of course, matters as well. What I find remarkable about the Chinese is I think they've realized this. Because if you look at what China is doing, they build every energy resource they can. They build coal-fired power plants, they build nuclear, they build solar, they build wind turbines, they do everything because they understood that the energy sector is not just a sector of the economy, it is the sector of the economy. You can't do anything without access to energy. And I think we in the West no longer understand this. There is a belief, both on parts of politicians, but also in the common population, that food comes from the supermarket, electricity comes from a socket in your wall, and money comes from the ATM. The idea that actually something has to happen, that this needs to come from where, is lost. And I want to give you a very clear example. Ed Miliband, right? The new, I think he's Secretary for Energy Security and Net Zero, which is, if there's a definition of an oxymoron, that's pretty much it. Right? That's like being an undertaker and a doctor at the same time, right? You would not trust such a person. And they have this great idea, say, we close our blast furnaces, right, which are basically coal-powered steel mills. And they say, we're going to replace them with electric arc furnaces. So they run mainly on electricity. But the problem is they need lots and lots and lots of electricity. But Ed Miliband also says, we don't need natural gas, right? We don't need coal, we don't need nuclear. We're going to do it with wind and solar. So their plan is, and as was also mentioned before, the new data centers. So their plan is to electrify the economy with less available electricity. Now, not everybody in this room is an economist, but let me ask you, what happens if you want to use more of a good, but you reduce the quantity and availability of that good? Yes, and don't be so shy. Yes, the price goes up. This is exactly right. And this is what's happening in many parts in Europe at the moment. We have entirely forgotten, right, that it's not enough to do something on an Excel sheet. It needs to be possible in real life. And this is a little bit the problem we have. And the last point, kind of really to drive this home, because we have there are people from Australia here, there are people from New Zealand here, and there you see it, we have this absurd situation in parts of the West where we would have energy resources and energy richness, but we are no longer willing to use the tools that would make them available. I think that New Zealand had one refinery, they closed it, and they thought it was a huge success from an environmental perspective. Well, what happened, you can imagine, a year later they had an energy crisis. Australia, similar problem, right? They are well endowed with resources, but they partially have to ship out the resources and have them refined somewhere else. As I said, Britain, the same thing. Most of the refineries in the West, from California to New Zealand to the United Kingdom, are over 100 years old. We no longer build new refineries because we supposedly, quote-unquote, transition away from fossil fuels. But the problem is we're not going to transition away from fossil fuels. We're going to transition away, it's such a passionate topic, it's hard for me to speak about it. We transition away from wealth and prosperity. And as a concluding remark, I was very excited. Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, he wrote now a report on competitiveness in Europe. Now, I don't know how many people of you still watch horror movies from the 1980s, but it's like you have Halloween 25 and all these movies where usually the bad guy dies at the end, but then there's one scene where the hand comes out of the grave, so he's never dead. And Mario Draghi is the same as a politician. Right? You think he's gone, he appears again. It's like an endless horror movie from the 1980s. And he wrote this report, and in the report he said, we have to identify why Europe is falling behind the United States. I said, a timely topic. I'm curious what he has to say. And in this 375-page document, The word fracking and shale is not mentioned a single time. So apparently nothing happened in the United States. Like apparently the American economy has nothing to do with turning from an energy importer to an energy exporter. I mean, it's a funny story, you know more about this than I do, when the Americans built all these imports facilities for liquefied natural gas, and then they had to redesign it to an export facility, apparently according to the EU, has nothing to do with American economies. This is like saying, my final remark, this is like saying when China would have said in 1860, we need to find out why the Europeans are doing better than we do, but one thing we know for certain, the steam engine has nothing to do with it. Thank you very much.
An excellent quote to end on, Professor. Next, I would like to invite up Mr. Csaba Gondola, who is the Chief Advisor to the Hungarian Energy Minister and has been a good friend in helping me understand energy in this country as well. Csaba.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for your invitation. And it seems like it's planned, but it's not. I'm also going to talk about the European Union a little bit, and then we can discuss the Hungarian issues as well. The inspiration is coming from the title of this panel, Dreams versus Real Needs, which basically the Green Deal, the most important politics of the European Commission, which aims at energy and climate. And I would, because of the time constraint, I would jump right in the middle. In 2019, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, just presented the European Green Deal. She basically set principles for climate change and structural change in economy, and described this as a moon on the man on the moon moment. The president of the Commission envisioned Europe as a global leader in fight against climate change. In her eyes, Europe can achieve this goal in a unique way by balancing economic growth and environmental protection, and while doing so, in the meantime, she can strengthen the position of the European Union in the global economy as well. Looking back 5 years after the presentation of the Green Deal, we can basically draw the consequences, but I would come back to this later. Simultaneously, her concept was stemming from some kind of green logic, giving the European Union's geopolitical and trade relations a specific moral context, which for somebody who's a rational person, it's always it's always good to be some moral foundation for policies, but if you only have moral foundations but not rational foundations, then it can cause some raised eyebrows at least. Ursula von der Leyen also announced at that time that we do not have all the answers yet. Today, this journey just begins, which is also quite weird from a block of 500 million of people. So we could already see back then that the Green Deal was short on substance. The plan that drastically and dramatically changed the economic structure of the entire community cannot be solely based on assumptions and wishes. And what we see after 5 years of the announcement that despite of billions of euros spent and all the efforts were made, it's already clear that only a few countries will meet the renewable energy goals and the climate goals by 2030, which was also admitted by the Commission itself. It is estimated that 4 to 8% of the global GDP would be needed to spend on the transformation, and the European numbers are the same. Not to mention that the Draghi report that Mr. Draghi said that this plan should cost around 3 times of the Marshall Plan back when, after the Second World War, when the U.S. basically rebuilt the whole western part of Europe. So, leaving no doubt, in my opinion, climate change is not a question. It's not a matter of belief. It's a matter of science. You can, of course, argue better if how much the individuals are contributing this, or if it's a natural phenomenon. But we see, and however, it's really important to note that the European Union only contributes to 7% of the greenhouse emission globally. My country, Hungary, while the measures are taken are really hurting our economies and will hurt our economies, will contribute to 0.1% by 2013 to this global emission. So the question should be asked whether does it worth it? And while we see that the European Union, the whole continent is just losing its competitivity, and we already started to lose jobs, traditional industries are building down, and we see green inflation, and we see that we basically trade some sort of dependence, typically Russian fossil dependence, to another source of dependence that is 80-something% are the solar panels are coming from China. Somebody who's responsible for navigating this ship should ask the question that, does it worth it, or will it worth it? And what we see is we still don't know yet, but it seems that the man on the moon movement is just lost somewhere in the emptiness. So I would stop in here, and if any questions coming specifically concerning Hungarian energy sector, I would be delighted to answer. But I thought that after this line of argument, the European context is as much as important as the Hungarian one. Thank you.
Finally, I would like to introduce Mr. Timothy Egan, who is the President and CEO of Canada Gas Association. Mr. Egan has been a long friend to the Institute, and we are happy to welcome him back. Tim.
Thank you, Logan. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Melissa and John and everybody at the Danube Institute and the Heritage Foundation for the opportunity to be here in Budapest. I am President and CEO of the Canadian Gas Association, but I'm speaking in a personal capacity today. And to begin, I want to underscore the comment of Dr. Deschel this morning, the prayer that our friend David Martin Jones, a great contributor here at the Danube Institute and so many other places, may he rest in peace. I too am going to focus on the specifics of the topic of our session, green dreams versus real, and have perhaps a blunt and fairly negative take on it, but I hope it's useful for the conversation that follows. Free market advocates, and I consider myself one, are enamored with innovation, and they see it as something to be encouraged. This is what feeds the creative destruction of the competitive market. Often the prospect for green energy is positioned as innovation. And the language of the innovation promoter, green or otherwise, often includes statements such as, this technology will revolutionize society, or this device will radically change how we do what we do, or this development will mean we no longer have to worry about X or Y. This is promotion. The innovator wants investment, and to get it, he or she promotes the technology to create enthusiasm for it, with the hope that the enthusiastic responses may be turned into quick investment. Now, sophisticated investors usually take the time to see through enthusiasm. They look at the fundamentals. They remember that change is invariably incremental, not hurried, and that overnight successes are really overnight news story successes, because practical application of the actual innovation is most often the product of hard work and constant adjustment over long periods of time, with much learning from failure. Most of us pretend to be sophisticated investors, but are not. Really, most of us are gamblers. We want to win the lottery. We want this idea to be the one that will suddenly change everything, and in the process, make us millions. And so in a market, we might run at a particular idea. We might get caught up in a craze. It might be a mining craze, or the dot-com craze of a few decades ago, or the more recent cryptocurrency craze. Now, usually what happens with each of these promotions is that a few people do make a lot of money. But most of us lose a little bit of money, and some of us lose a lot. And then we go back to the slow and steady, where most of us make a little bit of money through the more studied incremental approach of conventional market engagement. In my opinion, the enthusiasm for the green agenda is best seen as a big promotion for green investment. But it's become a particularly powerful one for two reasons. First, because it has become a deeply ideological promotion, not merely a commercial one. And second, because the biggest gambler in the game is not individual investors risking their own money, but national governments spending public dollars, taxpayer dollars, as somebody earlier today pointed out, and using the other tools of power to steer the market. So I'll take a moment on each of these. How is the promotion deeply ideological? It's ideological in that this is no longer just about a gadget or a process that will transform society. It's presented as a moral obligation, as something we must invest in because it is a threat to our existence not to do so. And it's morally wrong to do anything else. And so innovation involving hydrocarbons is often scorned and scoffed at. How dare you support something that's destroying humanity? Whereas investment in wind or solar technology or methane reduction technology is immediately applauded. Of course you should do that if you care about people and the planet. Now, moral suasion isn't new in commerce, but the language used with the green agenda is extreme and it takes hold. So people don't talk about the steady incremental change of energy systems, something which has been going on forever, as several of our other speakers have noted. We now talk, and with a sense of moral urgency, about the need for a just transition. We don't talk about the efforts to manage environmental impacts. We say we have to achieve net zero, a kind of promised land where everything will operate in perfect balance. But this is the language of religion, not commerce, and the fervor for it is more cult-like than it is religious. The effect of it on the public discourse is powerful, however. The second reason it's powerful is because government is playing such a large role in the game. Governments around the world are making bets on technology driven by a kind of ideological enthusiasm, not by national interest or energy security concerns. And they're doing so with massive sums of taxpayer dollars and legislative and regulatory authority. Of course, elected officials get elected promising to do things with taxpayer dollars all the time, and many of those things most citizens want them to do. Things like spending money on defense by national governments, or fixing potholes in the case of local governments. And some do want government involved in supporting technological research and development, particularly when national interests are concerned. But that's very different from governments making massive bets explicitly endorsing particular technological paths and banning others with taxpayers' money. But that's what governments in the West have been doing, especially over the last decade, in their green enthusiasm. Informed by the cult-like fervor of the call for dramatic change, we have governments advocating the spending of hundreds of billions of dollars on fuel X or gadget Y. We have governments saying things like, all energy should be delivered by this particular energy system, and then spending money on that system to the exclusion of alternatives, or often hand in hand with bans or restrictions on those alternatives. And this then prompts many in the private sector to respond supportively, either because taxpayer dollars are made available to them, they've been called rent seekers, or legislative or regulatory frameworks instituted by governments restrict their ability to do anything else, or because they just don't want to be offside. And all of this can lead us to assume that the green agenda is real, that we are about to end the use of hydrocarbons, and that a wind and solar electrified paradise lies around the corner. But we should question that assumption. First, because remembering the comment of Margaret Thatcher, at some point you do run out of other people's money. The public coffers for the green agenda are drying up, and will dry up further all over the world. Second, because as always, one of the practical implications of significant government intervention into markets is that costs go up, and they are going up everywhere where green energy is being promoted, as one of our other speakers noted. Rising costs make voters angry, and they eventually, as the expression goes, throw the bums out. Third, because certain energy fundamentals just can't be changed. In the last 30 years, the global market share of hydrocarbons has fallen from 86% to 82%, while the use of all major hydrocarbons has dramatically increased as energy consumption has increased by more than 50% over the same period. This despite the spending of hundreds of billions of dollars on things green. Hydrocarbons often offer the combination of energy density, flexibility, adaptability, affordability, and reliability that nothing else does. As the energy market analysts at S&G Global said in a recent report, today nearly 3 billion people still depend on traditional biomass sources for cooking and heating. For many of them, access to energy or carbonizing is likely the first step before decarbonizing. Green energy innovation offers promise because innovation always does, but presenting it as a panacea is simply untrue. No amount of cult-like rhetoric or government subsidy and intervention can change that, although they might create the impression of change in the near term. But the fervor will disappear in the face of reality, and governments, as big spending promoters, will ultimately be tossed. But in the meantime, the consumer suffers economically. And in a world where energy security is more important than it has been for decades, where our collective enemies are gaining strategic advance at our expense as we continue with our green diversion, the risk of even greater suffering for all of us as free citizens will only grow. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Egan. And for our first question that I would like to put to our panelists, when it comes to energy affairs itself, one of the biggest questions, as many of you already alluded to, is what energy we are utilizing, whether it's renewables such as solar and wind or non-renewables such as oil and gas. When it comes to those two elements, there are proponents for both. Those who are calling for renewables say that it's a matter of saving the planet and it's for, in a sense, harmonizing the world. For those that are proponents for hydrocarbons, such as oil and gas, they argue that what is needed now is sustainability and a proven track record, that new renewable sources are still unproven or not consistent. Going off of our title, Green Dreams versus Real Needs, is it possible to reconcile the two? What would it look like? Is it even feasible? Who would like to take the first jump? Who's brave enough to go first?
Ladies is first.
There we go. Okay. Is this on? Okay. This is actually a very good question. I think I would like to take one step back and follow up with our last speaker on this being an agenda. Something that we don't realize is that when we talk about green energy, we don't do a life cycle analysis at all, and we have a very biased view. For instance, if we compare these two cars, this car has carbon coming out of exhaust, the other one not. But there is not actually any clear analysis that suggests from mining the mineral to processing that, which is highly carbon intensive, and it actually uses a lot of energy, to producing and then decommissioning all of that, how much carbon or emission has been actually emitted. And number two is energy. How much energy we use to mine, process, later decommission these highly energy intensive renewables, and how much energy actually that produced. And number two that is very important is that the energy equity was mentioned. Actually, in people think energy poverty is just in Africa or maybe some part of Asia, but actually in US and Canada we have energy poverty. I have been to First Nations reservoirs, which these tribes don't absolutely have any energy. And unfortunately, in countries like United States or Canada, the areas that are producers, we have the production coming out, but often blocked by a liberal government. So these two factors are very important. I believe as an energy strategy, we need to have diversification. If you are Oman, you have a lot of unutilized land and sun. Solar might be a good option for you, but for some countries, no. So I think it's very tailor-made, specific to each country, that how we should have a combination. But I think we should have multiple sources, especially I think the way we are looking at the demand in future, we need as much as sources of energy we can. And so I think, yes.
In light of that comment of specifically tailor-made to each country, Mr. Gondola, any thoughts to what that looks like for Hungary?
Well, the Hungarian energy mix is, I would say, quite progressive. In just the last 5 years, we already reached 7 gigawatts of solar, which is, of course, sounds pretty good on the headlines. But after it passed like 4 gigawatts, we already started to see the backdraws, the serious backdraws of this. We are really proud that our energy mix is, because we don't have as much fossil fuels underground as other countries around us, then we are really proud that we can of course diversify in that manner. But I was just mentioning, if it's 80 or 90% of these final products, and we are not even talking about the raw materials itself, are coming from one specific, direction. It doesn't even matter what direction. That it's trading dependency to another type of dependency. So we are progressing. We are actually reached 2030 goals in that respect this year. We initially planned to have 6 gigawatts of solar by 2030. Now we have 7 in 2024, which is a big deal. Nevertheless, we need to produce electricity all the time, and not just when the sun is shining. And we just measured in the ministry that the solar panels, the effectivity of the solar panels in Hungary is just below 17%. So you have 83% of the time when it just doesn't function. And what you do, then you turn up the CCGT gas-powered engine and turbines, of course. And I just wanted to quickly turn back to your initial question. I think it's happening. I think it's a trend. It's an ideology. It's a religion, as it's been mentioned, and it's happening. I'm not sure if it's ever going to stop. The main problem is with this green transition, that the idea and the decision was made before, and not the technology drove the religion itself or the trend. So we probably never seen in the history a policy that was made before the technology was even there. It's like, okay, let's do combustion engines in 1700s. Nobody could do that. So that's the major problem.
Mr. McCown?
Yeah, I just want to say real quickly, this is very fascinating, and you're spot on, because science, data, engineering eats policy for lunch every day of the week. You can't just say, make it so, and it is so. That's not how it works, right? And unfortunately, we have people that either don't have real-world training or experience, or we're professors. What works on the whiteboard doesn't necessarily always work in the real world, right? And so if you are a worker and you have a tool chest, you have more than one tool in the box, right? You can't use a hammer for everything. We may know some people that try, but you need a saw, you need a hammer, you need wrenches, you need different tools. Such is the same with our energy mix. And that mix will naturally change over time as things become more efficient. Maybe they're better in one place and not in another place. But these mandates, mandating France to put up solar panels when they have low-cost nuclear, insane, right? The demand destruction of German businesses as a result of some of these energy choices. We have to be smarter and understand that, the energy mix will change over time. But just because somebody says, make it so, we're met with terrible consequences. And the Draga report actually suggests in his 300, who said it, 300 and...
I think it's 347 pages.
347 pages. Well, this doesn't work, so the EU needs to take control of the private energy market and institute price caps. Newsflash, spoiler alert, that's going to make it worse. Prices are going to go higher and you're going to have even less. No, the problem with gas is people have been buying stuff on the spot market and not having long-term contracts. That's why prices are high. So we can get to these things, but we're not going back to the future, we're going back to the past.
If I could just, we always talk about diversity in terms of specific technology diversity, and we seem to speak about wind and solar and hydro and nuclear, and then hydrocarbons. Wind and solar and hydro and nuclear are all technologies for the generation of electricity. Electricity worldwide is roughly 20% of our energy use, 1/5, right? The other 80% is for heating, either ambient heating and cooling, or industrial heating, which is enormous, or it's for transportation. So when you think about diversity, it's very easy to let the language of electricity and the language of energy become interchangeable, but they're not interchangeable, because electricity is just one piece of the big picture. So really, when we talk about diversity, we should first make sure we understand the context that there are three big ways energy is used, and how are those balanced, and are those being developed appropriately everywhere in the world where we want to bring people out of poverty. And then the second thing about diversity we should think about is, how is energy actually getting to the consumer? Because again, we tend to default to the assumption that all energy gets to the consumer as electricity. But in fact, the vast majority of energy doesn't get to the consumer as electricity, right? We move energy over solid delivery systems, so moving wood, moving coal by train, by truck, whatever. By liquid delivery systems, oil by pipelines or by tankers. By gaseous delivery systems, again by pipelines. And then as electrons on wires. The smallest percentage of the whole picture. So I think when we have that diversity conversation, we got to first make sure we understand some of the fundamentals of how energy is actually used and delivered, because it changes the conversation fundamentally. And suddenly you're not talking about, with all due respect, 7 gigawatts of solar, good for you, but electricity is only a portion of Hungary's energy needs, and solar is only a portion of that electricity mix. So we can all, and I understand the need to do that politically, say, look how much solar we're putting in place, but the public develops an assumption that, and that's going to meet our energy needs. When in fact, as was demonstrated in the province of Alberta this past winter, when it hit -50 for several days, and not a single solar panel was working, you know, it's after 5 p.m. at night, people were going to freeze to death if they didn't have access to everything else.
Professor Schulhammer? Yeah, just real quick, I think this is a very important distinction, but what always worries me is what we see, the experiment in Europe is we see decarbonization via deindustrialization. And the problem, of course, with this is if a steel mill leaves, there's an aluminum smelter leaves, these things are investment intensive, they don't just come back. And this is, I think, one of the trends that really worries me. And the approach that is taken by Draghi and by others, and I don't really have a personal issue with the man, I'm sure he's a nice guy, is it's like they're in an airplane and somebody hands them a parachute. And they say, we know this one is working, but I don't really like it. I don't like the color, right? And then they say, I'll jump out of the airplane and I'm going to invent a completely new, untested parachute while I'm, midway from the airplane down to the ground. And maybe it's going to happen, right? If you go onto Google, I know it's the worst answer that somebody can give, and new battery technologies. Like now for 15 years, I'm hearing about this incredible battery breakthrough that's going to come and then will make any other form of energy obsolete, because wind and solar will then, for electricity needs, it will charge those miracle batteries and everything is going to be fine. And my answer is always, okay, fine, let's do a prototype, right? Because the problem is we have arrogance and hubris in one. So it says, give me one average town and power it only by wind, solar, batteries, and electric cars. And the answer I always get is, you can't do it for a town, you can only do it for all of Europe. And this is something where I say, something seems very much off here, right? Something is suspicious here. And this goes back to what you said, because in nature, it's more religious very often than anything else. And the best proof for thing is, I think for this is the very simple one, and this was also mentioned before. Okay, fine, decarbonize hybrid nuclear. But for whatever reason, like those who are so worried about the environment also dislike nuclear. So there's a lot of psychology, a lot of ideology going on, and this is so bothersome very often for people, I think, like us here, who approach this on a very kind of level-minded, kind of facts-based, clear-sighted approach, because we are not arguing necessarily with people who are just looking at this as a technical problem to solve. For them, it is something they poured their entire heart and soul into. So it's very much, you try to convince somebody who believes in something with counterfactuals, and I think that is very difficult. I think you have to give people something else to believe. This is why I tend to be an energy radical. I say, well, this is really cool stuff, right? Just as some people are against it, I say it's just as cool to be for it. But I think you have to appeal to people's emotions at least as much as you have to appeal to their rational faculties.
I'd like to move on to the second question for our panel, and Mr. Egan already alluded to this when it comes to the question of alliances and relations. Europe has been one of the has really been ground zero when it comes to the consequences of energy relations. For a long time, Russia was the biggest supplier of natural gas and oil to the European Union until the war broke out in Ukraine, during which most of Europe tried to decouple from Russia in an effort to deprive Putin's government of war funds. The result has been a partial success, but not to the extent that it convinced Russia to stop the war. There was also consequences for Europe. There were very high energy prices, which continue on. And over the past couple of summers, there was even the specter of rationing that was only avoided thanks to the fact that we had a warm winter out here. It was not policy or reserves that saved it. To the degree, it was the weather. Now compare this to Hungary's approach, which took a different path. Hungary has maintained its energy relations with Russia, still importing oil and still having nuclear assets, which has caused it a lot of problems on the international stage, has made it to an extent ostracized from the rest of Europe and the United States, but it has maintained much more consistent energy, and it has maintained manageable energy prices. So with that in mind, what needs to be considered when nations are building energy relations with other countries?
Can I just make a very quick point? I think, first of all, you want to produce as much at home as you can. Very often I find energy is very much like the migration issue, right? There are things you want to do at home. You want to have your own babies, you don't want to import them, and you want to have your own energy sources. There are things you should do at home. And just a very quick thing about the sanctions, and I'm curious to hear something from the people on this panel, and maybe also the audience, is everybody who interacts with the oil and gas or the resource industry, right, knows that most in the industry make money via price and not via volume, via quantity. And then the European Union and others as well, they made sanctions where they basically were sanctioning volume and not price. So these sanctions, for anyone who was really engaged with the industry, knew that they would fail. So the question I'm having then is, were the people involved in designing those sanctions, did they really have no idea what they were doing? And if that is the case, why would I trust them on anything else? Right? The same people who told me they understand the energy market so well that they can sanction Russia down to their knees, which failed, also tell us that they can make the energy transition work. It's just I don't have trust in those who are currently in charge. Again, I'm sure they're privately nice people, but the areas they work in, I'm just very doubtful that they know what they're doing.
If you don't mind, just add a couple of thoughts. Of course, sanctions are typically not the best tool to reach your what you want to reach. I mean, if you just go back to the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon put a blockade around the British Isles, basically all the goods just circumvented, relabeled. It was much more expensive, and it came through Venice and Palermo and all the southern states. That's what's happening basically today. Many just don't know that European people are using so-called Turkish blend, Indian blend, Pakistani blend. You can blend everything. How the earth you would tell where the natural gas is coming from? In the case of the crude oil, at least you have some substance that I don't know, some elements are different. But in the case of the natural gas, it's totally undefinable. So many just don't know that even the home country or the mother country just, of course, sanctioned and bravely sanctioned and told the people that we don't use Russian energy sources anymore. Just get in the car and use Russian oil in Germany same time. It's also pretty important to highlight that after the Russian natural gas was banned, the Russian LNG consumption in Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium went up with 30 or 40% because you had to replace it somewhere. I mean, it's just not falling down, luckily, from the earth. Norway get rich out of this situation, of course. But you got to mention that, for example, Poland using PB gas around like 94 or 96%, also originating from Russia. So, I mean, if you have a policy that is based on wishes, not the reality, then you can sell it. If you are smart enough and a good politician, you can sell it, of course, and you get reelected, no problem. But the reality is when you know, one prime minister sits in the car and wants to go to another capital, that he's likely going to burn Russian gas. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to say this without revealing who it is. So one of your foreign ministers came to Washington, D.C., and this person was so proud of all the sanctions. And this, I'm also being gender neutral intentionally. And this person said, well, we've just put the 28th or whatever the package is. And I looked and said, you know, it's not working. And this person was like, completely deflated. Like, what do you mean? We've suffered hardship. I said, yeah, congratulations. You have subsidized cheaper energy for India, for other countries, while you've committed self-harm. China, right? India now refines more petroleum than it has ever used. Gee, where did that come from? It's not working. And sanctions only work if the entire world is on board, right? And there are other alternatives. And as we've seen through trade with some of the Eastern European countries whose trade with Russia has gone up exponentially, you know, it's not hard to figure out that people figure out a way around sanctions. And I'm all for trying to push Russia into stopping its war of aggression on Ukraine. It's been a terrible thing. But I think we've harmed ourselves more than we've harmed them. Okay, we have taken some stuff away, especially on the gas side. But I just saw last week Germany's importing LNG from Russia. So it's not working, and we need to do something different.
Sure. I don't like the word policy because it's very short-sighted. So I think if you're looking and planning for energy diplomacy, we need to first know what is the strategy. And that's very important. If I want to pick up on sanctions, you know, and also you were talking about how effective they were. The thing is, market is practical, and we cannot starve or be slaves or not have energy. So the history of sanctions on multiple countries, energy sanctions, indicate that sanctions only work when the world doesn't need that sources. For instance, a good example of that is Iranian sanctions. A few years ago, it worked. Iran could not export. But now, today, we see that Iran's export a lot. Administration in U.S. doesn't say a word about that because the world needs that. The administration needs that for its re-election and the prices. In case of Russian sanctions, the interesting factor was that when we in the U.S., the president announced the voluntary ban on import of Russian energy sources, he said our sources, it was never, ever mentioned. They did not lie, but they did not say that we will stop importing everything from Russia except for the nuclear fuel, because about 20% of U.S. nuclear fuel is supplied from Russia. We have isotopes for our medical and industries that are only provided and imported from Russia. So, in fact, if Russia would put sanctions on U.S., you know, we would have maybe a problem with our electricity. So maybe the sanctions were set. Going back to your question that did not work, maybe the sanctions intentionally were set not to work because no one could substitute that. But, you know, policymakers have to, it seems, show some policy. But we see that it didn't work. And in fact, some of those policies are undermining and create new vulnerability. In reaction to Russian sanctions, the first thing EU did was saying that, okay, we do not want to import gas from Russia. In order to reduce our dependence on Russia, we're going to announce in our taxation that nuclear is green, not thinking that Russia is the major dominant in the nuclear world. And in fact, by mentioning that nuclear is green, you are rapidly increasing Rosatom business, because now whoever wants to bring the green money into nuclear will import that from Russia. So I think overall on energy diplomacy, I think it should be based on a strategy, not policy. There are a lot of things we don't consider. We don't consider the life cycle analysis, how much energy is produced. We forget that when we want to change all the cars in US from combustion engine to EV, we forget that 70% of car body is made of oil and petrochemicals, so we increase the demand for oil. And also, we are focused only on supply. We have to punish suppliers. We never talk about demand. Why there's no regulations on AI, why there's no regulations on cryptocurrencies, you know, why the consumption is not managed, why the whole target is producers.
I was just going to say,
Hungary has had to suffer the slings and arrows of the hypocrisy of the European Union, because Hungary just is acting like a rational player in a market, and the European Union is virtue signaling. And for a Canadian to tell somebody else they're virtue signaling is a lot, because we've become very good at it in public.
All right, we have just about 2 minutes left. I think we would have time for one question from the audience. If anybody has a quick, concise question, please keep it very brief. Melissa.
Does anyone have a reaction to Ed Miliband's letter that he wrote to the head of the National Energy Grid, which revealed that there is no plan on the part of our leaders?
I just want to mention one anecdote about that. Just in UK and taxpayers' money, it was just the news that UK realized one of the power plants, the biofuels, that they spent $22 billion of taxpayer money to subsidize that, created 4 times more emission than their coal power plants. So I think not only having a strategy, as was mentioned by the speaker, actually some of these policies are being realized that are creating more harm, and taxpayer money, as was mentioned, was somehow wasted.
Oh, just very quick. I think that's a great point, because everywhere in Europe, but also in the United States, the grid is coming under more and more stress. I don't know who it was. I think the American Industry Association, they wrote the letter to the White House. They're running out of transformers. Because there is so much more stress now on the grid, and I think there are now waiting times for 3 years. So this is the problem. You mentioned this before. What looks good on a whiteboard or in an Excel sheet is very often neglecting other very important factors. And as it also was mentioned before by Mr. Egan, was absolutely correct. It's not just the production of energy, it's also the transportation. So it's great if you have all these delocalized, let's say, wind, solar farms offshore, but you still need to get electricity where it is needed. You need transformers, you need cables, you need resources. And very often I feel that the politicians like to make points on their green credentials, but they don't really know what's actually going on in reality.
All right, and on that note, I would encourage anybody who's sticking around to please talk with our panelists during coffee, which is coming up next. And I want to thank our panelists for an excellent debate and discussion. Thank you very much, everybody. And finally, I would like to remind everybody, after this coffee break, we will have our closing discussion between Prime Minister Tony Abbott of Australia and His Excellency Ambassador Peter Stare from Hungary. Thank you very much, everyone.
Today we have a very special panel to close the afternoon, our closing discussion on the topic, Hungary's place in the global order. And we're very honored to have today a very distinguished panel. I'm not sure how we could get a more distinguished panel, actually. So our moderator today, hopefully he'll stay, is James Carafano, and he's Senior Counselor to the President and E.W. Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, obviously our partner with this conference. And he's going to be in discussion with 3 people. First of all, Robert Wilkie, who's the former U.S. Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Also, Ambassador Peter Stare, who's just flown back from Kyrgyzstan today to join us. We're very honored to have you. Thank you. And also, of course, almost needs no introduction, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott. And I'm going to leave them to continue this discussion. And Mr. Carafano, take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I am an American, so I have to apologize for that. So this is going to be a completely unscripted, no safety net thing. So I did not give them the questions beforehand. I checked. None of them are wearing the earrings with the microphone. I looked. I checked, right? And I won't fact check any of them. I already promised that. And if they screw up, I'm not going to save them. I'm not going to commercial break. No, we're just going to. So look, I think this has been a fantastic. We were talking, for example, about the energy panel. You could not go anywhere in Europe today and hear an energy panel like that. This really. And it's kind of been like that all day. And I thought the one thing we haven't really had an opportunity is to have a conversation. And so we have a topic, but really, this is your time to engage with three really great strategic leaders from 3 different parts of the world that all converge here in Hungary and affect the future of this country. So it's a tremendous opportunity for all of us to hear your thoughts and questions from the panel. So I'm going to ask them each one question as soon as I think of one, and then we're going to get going. So maybe we'll start down under. So what's really great about having you here is I think you have the most distant perspective of watching every day what's going on in the transatlantic community, how that's impacting Hungary. So let me ask you, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I think the world has never been more dangerous, at least in my lifetime.
And that was proof, living proof right there. Nobody ever slipped at a Danube conference before today.
But the West, which has been so successful and which has given so much to the wider world over the last couple of 100 years, is under challenge as never before. It's internally challenged and it's externally challenged. The external challenge is from the discontented dictatorships. There's the war in Ukraine, the militarists in Moscow. There's the potential new Holocaust in the Middle East, the Islamists in Tehran. And then there's the potential war over Taiwan, the communists in Beijing. That's bad enough. But the West, which looked like it had ended history just 30 years back, has never been less self-confident. There are dreadful internal challenges, particularly around the climate and emissions obsessions, which are doing so much to damage the economic strength and the social cohesion of the West. So I think we need to get serious about these things. I think we are sleepwalking through Lotus Land, and Lotus Land might suddenly turn terrifying indeed if any one of the external threats escalates. But the weaker we are, the more likely it is that one of them will escalate. And if one escalates, I think the other two will as well.
Well, Mr. Secretary, who has, arguably 2 of the most critical portfolios for the safety and security of Hungary, how does that world look from Hungary's perspective?
Well, in one word, and thank you for the invitation to the organizers, everyone. In one word, I would say it's frightening. Because we have been used in the past 30 years to a more or less balanced situation, of course, with problems here and there in the Western Balkans, in Georgia. But what's happening now is really a new chapter in the post-Cold War era. And for a country like Hungary, which tries to pursue a kind of sovereign foreign policy, it's really difficult to navigate on these uncharted waters. And it's really difficult to strike a balance between our openness to the world and, on the other hand, our obligations as a NATO and an EU member. Just one example. I think we had a very good consensus for 2 years in NATO since the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, that NATO is not getting closer to this conflict, and individual allies can do whatever they want to support Ukraine, to train troops, whatever, but NATO as such, as an organization, will not be involved. And then suddenly, the proposal came this April to the Foreign Ministerial that we have to change that. And then, what do you do as a responsible NATO member? I mean, we want to have unity, we want to have rational decisions, we want to strengthen collective defense, Article 5, but we are convinced that this decision to involve NATO as a coordinating body in the training and the weapons supply systems to Ukraine is not a good decision. So what could we do? We didn't want to block the decision, we didn't want to break unity, but we opted for not participating in this. But this is only one example. So it's getting more and more difficult for a country of the size of Hungary to navigate on these waters.
Yeah. So those are 2 really interesting perspectives. One from the external of sleepwalking through history, and the other the challenges and the frustrations and the friction of trying to wake up. So I have a question for you. You don't get off as easy. I'm not going to ask you what keeps you up at night, because I know it's Mrs. Wilkie. But so I'm going to ask you the.
It's not the call from Trump at 2 o'clock.
No. So I want to ask you the question, and I know you're going to speak tomorrow as a keynote, which is fine. But I want to ask you the question everybody wants an answer to, and I'll caveat. Everybody knows that Secretary is not speaking for Mr. Trump, not speaking for the campaign. He's clearly here in his personal capacity. But the question that everybody has is, as we hear, the world is seeking trouble. Europe is struggling with finding its way forward. What should the transatlantic community expect from Donald Trump if he's the next president of the United States?
Well, first of all, my Jesuit masters would have appreciated the analogy that the Prime Minister gave. If you remember the problems Odysseus had in the land of the lotus eaters, he fell asleep. And I would hope that our friends in the transatlantic community would see an America awake again. Let me paint some very drastic pictures here. And by the way, listening to Professor Stokes, I agree with everything that he said about the future of America in this century. The only warning I would give is it will be a continuation of the 20th century rise of the United States if we regain our confidence as a nation. We are on a trajectory, ladies and gentlemen, to hit 2% of GDP on defense. We have not hit that since the administration of Calvin Coolidge, and that year was 1922. We have a intelligentsia that is ashamed of American power. It is ashamed of America's special place in the world. Cultural Marxism that is preached on our college campuses has now become the marching cadence of a major political party in our country. America has to remind itself that America is great because America has been good. I don't want to throw a lot of aphorisms around, but I mean, we're talking about the only nation in the history of the world to offer a helping hand to all the peoples of the world, including our enemies. And that gives us a unique place in history. It gives us a unique place today. The great Theodore Roosevelt said, "You cannot lead a nation unless you elevate it." I will give you an example of what it means not to elevate a nation. Some of you will remember that in March of 2021, the person who passes for the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, was confronted by his counterpart from the People's Republic. For 30 minutes on American soil, Mr. Blinken was harangued with charges of America as a racist oppressor, as the font of every global problem on the planet. And the only thing Mr. Blinken could do in response was mouth faculty lounge pieties about how we have to do better. Ladies and gentlemen, had that been Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump, the response would have been that the United States of America will not be lectured by a country that has murdered 100 million of its own people since 1949. That is the kind of response that is needed if we are to maintain the order that has existed in some form or another since the days of the British Empire. A country protecting the global commons. You know, Lord Escher once said, and I apologize for getting too deep into this, that in the confrontation with Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, the Kaiser only had one perspective, and that was the continent of Europe. Said the King of Great Britain is troubled by the fall of a leaf on every part of the planet. That was the perspective of Imperial Britain, and that mantle was transferred to the United States. So we have to regain our confidence. We have to confront the naysayers in the same way that this nation, Hungary, has elevated its culture and its history to remind its people of a great past, and that past informing the future. And on the practical and material side, we have to regain our military strength. Without the power of American deterrence, nothing else will work in this planet. Because we are faced with a three-headed monster, 3.5 if you include little Kim, that tells us every day that they want to kill us. And I will mention Mrs. Mayer tomorrow, but Mrs. Mayer was very clear. If someone tells you over and over again he wants to kill you, believe him. And that's the attitude the United States must have. We are not going to go abroad in search of war, as Mr. Trump has said, but we will do everything we can to prevent it.
Well, so we have, I know that applause was for me. Thank you very much. So we have questions. I don't know, how do we do questions? You raise your hand and then somebody brings it. Is that the way we do it with a microphone? Is that the way it works?
If we want to do it with a microphone, I have to steal somebody's microphone.
Yeah, we'll share a microphone. That's perfect. So raise your hand. And yeah, so we got a question over here for good. Oh, great, thanks. So we have one question over here we'll start with. And this is great. So we have tension, we have stressors from without, we have tensions from within, and we have a promise that the cavalry will be on the way, maybe. Okay. So yeah, please.
So yeah, my question is about Taiwan, because the US already started its decoupling. The Biden administration started to build semiconducting factories in Arizona and so on and so on. And possibly Trump will continue this, and if he wins. But will the US defend an ally that is not so important for its interests in its economic connectivity if it can produce the chips on its own? So will it defend Taiwan if the Chinese aggression is coming?
Thank you. So let's do this. Tony, let me start with you because you're closest. You can see Taiwan from there. But do me a favor though. Whatever you're going to say, would you also talk about why is Taiwan important to all of us? Especially for a transatlantic community. And then Robert, if we're going to defend them or not. So please.
Well, Taiwan is important to Beijing because Taiwan is living, breathing proof. Liberal democratic Taiwan is living, breathing proof that there is no totalitarian gene in the Chinese DNA, which is why Beijing must, as soon as it can, crush Taiwan. So Taiwan matters, and when the Chinese say over and over again they will take it, if necessary by force, as soon as possible, they have to be taken absolutely seriously. Now, will America defend Taiwan? I don't know. But if America doesn't defend Taiwan, the whole global order resting on US alliances collapses, and every country either makes a difficult accommodation with the CCP or it arms itself to the teeth against it. So the disruptions caused by the war in Ukraine are many orders of magnitude lesser than the disruptions that would be caused by any Beijing assault on Taiwan.
Well, Mr. Biden blew right through, and he didn't know he did it, the strategic ambiguity that has existed since the administration of Richard Nixon about America's desire to defend Taiwan. It's always been there, but it has always been part of a calculation that an enemy of the United States had to make, will we or won't we? Let me go back to what I said briefly at the beginning about America's role in defending the global commons. This was first tried out by Mr. Jefferson when the Barbary pirates were seizing every American ship in the Mediterranean, enslaving our sailors. Mr. Jefferson, who is viewed by most as some monkish aesthete who lived on a mountaintop in Virginia and read books, the notion that someone would steal American soldiers and convert them to Islam fired up his revolutionary fervor and his hatred of established religions. And the next thing he did was send the entire United States fleet to North Africa, and he told the Bey of Algiers, you either surrender or we burn your town. Taiwan sits, and the Prime Minister can talk about it, sits on the busiest shipping lanes in the planet. If Beijing controls those lanes, it has a dagger at the heart of all of our friends in Asia. And it tips the world calculation, the balance, decidedly in favor of totalitarian forces. Now, Biden blew through the strategic ambiguity and said we would defend Taiwan. This is at the same time, and Jim can give you facts and figures as well on this, as he has, just recently I was in Japan, and while I was there, the Japanese were told that Biden had just decommissioned 25 of our pre-positioning ships in Pacific, ships that were to rearm our naval vessels on the way to the Chinese waters. We cannot defend Taiwan if we have no navy. We have the smallest navy since the end of World War I, and it is continuing to get smaller. And one other thing, just for you the military minds out here, and I think the Prime Minister would agree with this, I think we've been absolutely wrong in the way we've gone about helping Taiwan defend itself. We've been selling them capital ships and planes. Now they're never going to be able to match the People's Liberation Army Air Force plane for plane. But what they can do is turn their island into a ballistic hedgehog with sea mines, undersea drones, naval drones, air drones, and make the cost prohibitive for China to come across those straits. We're not doing that either. But the loss of Taiwan would be a calamity for the West. It would be a calamity for the entire world just because of the economic impact alone.
So, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to come back and ask you about I want to give you a second to think about this and ask you a question, because one of the really fascinating things about this conversation is the whole focus of this conference has been about this notion of order, and we focused on the transatlantic community, but it's interesting how quickly, right, we've bridged to talking about, well, the Indo-Pacific also impacts on that. And so I'm going to ask you in a second about your views on this, because I know Hungary, for example, has been very clear on the right for there to be a free and independent Ukraine, that you don't move borders by war. And so I'm interested on what the perspective would be on Taiwan. And then, Tony, I want to come back to you and ask you to kind of, as a follow-up, how do you see this thing going? How's it going to unfold in the next 10 years? But I just wanted to amplify the point you just said, because a lot of people don't get this. It has nothing to do with Taiwan's a democracy or microchips or anything. Taiwan is the key island in the first island chain. If China controls Taiwan and the Straits of Taiwan, first of all, their entire diesel nuclear fleet could deploy to sea and be virtually untouchable, and it would tremendously increase their strategic strike. But more importantly, they basically would lock the United States out of the Indo-Pacific as a naval power, period, end of statement. Korea and Japan would be completely cut off and isolated. It would be world-changing if Taiwan came under the control of China.
Well, the outermost Japanese island is 45 miles from Taiwan.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to discuss Hungary's place in the global order, and we are discussing Taiwan now. I don't say that the situation there does not have an impact on us, of course, but from a Central European point of view, again, I mean, our first and foremost concern is how we can strengthen our collective defense here. We hope that there will be no escalation, but I think all parties have an interest in maintaining the present situation, basically. So I don't think China has an appetite in the foreseeable future to do anything wrong, because it would lose so much that I don't think that would be a rational policy on behalf. Yeah. In the long run, of course, we don't know what would happen. And the US has a bilateral security agreement, guarantees for Taiwan. It's an interesting question how that relates to the Washington Treaty and Article 5, because we are not part of that security arrangement. Right. But if something very serious happens, of course, it will be very tricky to handle that politically, what NATO members can do or what NATO members cannot do. But the baseline is that we hope that pragmatism will prevail, and all the parties will realize that there is no sense in breaking out a new conflict which would have global effects.
Yes, but wishful thinking is not a very good basis for policy. And there's been far too much wishful thinking in recent times, including a lot of wishful thinking, which we were all guilty of until the last few years. A lot of wishful thinking about China. Look, we make a terrible mistake when we impute our rationality to dictators. Of course, it's not in China's best interest to attack Taiwan, but it wasn't in Putin's best interest to attack Ukraine either. But for Putin, what matters is re-establishing the Russia of Peter the Great and overcoming his equivalent of the century of humiliation. And for the commissars in Beijing, sure, they may be slightly more rational because that's a party dictatorship as opposed to a personal dictatorship. But in the end, what matters to them is the prestige of the CCP. And they have repeatedly promised not only that they would take Taiwan, but that they will be the world's #1 power by mid-century. And taking Taiwan is the next big step in that inevitable progress. So I think this idea that it's not going to happen because it wouldn't be in their interests is as I may say, if I may say so, the very quintessence of the wishful thinking that is getting us into dreadful trouble.
Well, I think we don't know today what is wishful thinking. And if you look at the trade figures, I mean, Australia's biggest trading partner is China, I guess. And I think there's a certain degree of pragmatism here. So we can have megaphone diplomacy with very belligerent messages, but I think that doesn't help keeping calm the situation. And what Hungary is saying, that we have to remain practical in a way. We have to prepare for anything, but at the same time, let's not close the channels. And this includes also Russia and also China. Because if we close the channels, we will have no solutions for future problems.
And when China says things like Australia is chewing gum on China's boot, and when China officially puts out appalling imagery of Australian soldiers supposedly committing war crimes in Afghanistan, we don't respond. So there is no escalation from Australia, but there is this ceaseless abuse from the commissars in Beijing, accompanied by boycotts of $20 billion worth of Australian trade. Now, obviously, any trouble with China has enormous economic ramifications for us, but we just have to live with that if it comes. And sure, if from Hungary's perspective, Taiwan is a small island a long way away, just like Czechoslovakia was a small country of which we know little, in Chamberlain's words after Munich. But in the end, freedom is global, and it either advances globally or it retreats globally. And if the friends of freedom are blasé about a dreadful assault on freedom anywhere, well, then I think freedom everywhere is diminished. And again, if I may go back to our own history, I mean, almost nothing was further away from Australia than the Great War. Right. But 60,000 Australians died in the Great War, not in vain, because they helped defeat, and I probably shouldn't say this here, but they helped defeat the militarism that at that time was stalking Europe. And again, in the Second World War, I mean, what interest did Australia have in Poland? And yet our Prime Minister said, well, Britain has declared war, and therefore Australia is at war. Now, if we were to just say, should the Americans and the Japanese go to help the Taiwanese, none of our business, all too hard, we don't want to disrupt our trade, that would be a shameful and a disgraceful act.
So we're gonna go to another question, but I do want to tie in the point you actually both made about interconnectedness and the strategic notion that stability breeds stability. I mean, your point is we need a stable, secure, and prosperous Western Europe, and I think, you know, from the U.S. perspective, you know, we've woefully been inattentive in the Middle East. We need a stable Middle East. If both those theaters are stable, then that actually contributes to stability in Asia, because if you're the only game in town, you know, creating problems is less in your favor. So you both, in your way, kind of notion that connecting all these dots together is in the end what's really going to achieve the kind of outcomes.
And the revisionist countries need to understand that the status quo powers want to be good friends But if the revisionist countries choose otherwise, we will be very bad enemies indeed.
Yeah. Do you want to have to follow up on that? No. So another question from this guy I don't trust. He stole the name from a guy that invented the Muppets, which I think is wrong. And he could only get away with that because he was a special forces guy, and nobody goes to a special forces guy and tells them they can do anything they don't want to do. Or related to some Muppets. Go ahead, Joe.
So the only time that was ever really funny was on Twitter X. I always get the Jim head. You invented the Muppets. You should shut up on X. One guy actually said you were a lot funnier when you had your hand up a frog's ass. That was funny. Mr. Prime Minister, in the greatest spirit of friendship, I have to ask you, what happened to Oz? My son-in-law is from Sydney. He is a brilliant kid. He is soft as a marshmallow. He has ingested the woke mind virus, as has most of the Anglosphere. And much of what we want to do, collectively, I believe, is arrest that institutional capture and cultural weakening and become, I want the Australia of my younger days. I want Crocodile Dundee. That ain't a knife. This is a knife. I want that. I don't want,
That's a terrible accent.
It doesn't matter. He knew it. But the thing is, we are all, and I think this applies to most of the European countries too, we've all been pulled so far culturally left that our politics and our diplomacy and everything have become that flavor of weak. And until we can arrest that and turn the page, and I'll say we're standing right here in a country that I think's done that. I think Hungary is a great example of how to be a muscular, conservative, positive, family, nation, God-oriented country. How do we get the Anglosphere back on track?
Jim, that was an unexpectedly brilliant question. Thank you. So I want to let you answer that, but then I also want to hear, Peter, if you could talk a bit about how Hungary views this entry between cultural strength and issues of national security and prosperity. And then, Bob, nobody is more familiar with you than the challenges in the U.S. military in terms of readiness and how these issues are impacting that. So I think this is a brilliant question. So please.
Well, let me say that I think Hungary has handled the internal challenges to the West very well. Hungary has not succumbed to identity politics, it's resisted all the woke edicts from Brussels. It's doing its best to preserve its sense of self, its national identity, its national character. It's encouraging its people to be proud of its past and therefore more confident about the future. So I think on the internal challenges that are sapping the West, Hungary has been outstanding, and Viktor Orban has done a great job in all of that. But our problem, and it's particularly acute in the Anglosphere, as you say, the most successful countries on earth are now the ones that are most plagued with crippling self-doubt. America is guilting itself over slavery, Britain is guilting itself over the empire, Australia is guilting itself over Indigenous dispossession. We don't fly the Australian national flag anymore, other than in company with 2 Indigenous flags. And this is because we feel that the flags of under 4% of the population need to fly co-equally with the flag of 100% of the population in order to atone for the shameful act of British settlement on the 26th of January 1780. So we've just got to get over ourselves and accept that our history is what it is, and there's much more good in it than bad, and we need to, I think the phrase is, toughen the fuck up. That's what we need to do.
Well, thank you for this. Not the last sentence, but no, but it's very, very
politically incorrect comments.
Clear. I'm a diplomat, so I have to restrain myself. But yes, the pressure is immense, and we are very proud that we have been able, as a relatively small country with scarce resources, to resist the huge cultural pressure that is on us, coming from overseas, but also coming from our European partners. And the problem is that because of this political correctness, because of wokeism, because of the ultra-gender propaganda, we are not anymore able to address the real threats and the real challenges, because our attention is derived by these unimportant things. And there's one example. The EU was working on drafting operational plan for one of its civilian operations, and everything was agreed. The last thing that we were discussing for weeks was about the gender formula, you know, which is very dangerous, I think, because we are not anymore able to address the common threats, to find what is our common interest, and then to find the tools how we can tackle those, you know. And a little bit, NATO is also moving towards this. So effective multilateralism that you hear so many times quoted is not working in that way. And if there is a minority position, then again, the bigger countries do not want to consider whether it's rational or not. They just shove aside the minority position, although it can be rational and it's legitimate. And I always say this, it's legitimate to have a minority position because maybe we are right. As, for example, with the huge migration wave in 2015, where 500,000 people walked through my country, and Hungary was alone with its position that we have to defend our external borders, we have to decide who is eligible for asylum status outside the border, and that we have to bring the help there and not to bring the problem here. And now, if you look at it, the mainstream European position is almost identical with this. Maybe they will not admit, but this is, you know. So I think that's what we should have, because the platform for rational, down-to-earth, real, frank discussions is diminishing. It's limited now, and with that we'll not be able to defend ourselves against bigger troubles.
Yeah, let me give you an example of a real-world fight that I had. I was privileged to lead the second largest department in the federal government, Department of Veterans Affairs. Veterans Affairs was born out of the second most, well, the most biblically righteous address ever given by an American, the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln, which he delivered 4 weeks before his martyrdom. And the operative words of that is he cast blame for that great cataclysm in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. He said, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and his widow and orphan, and to secure for us and our posterity and the world a just and lasting peace. Those words are were on the walls of every Veterans Affairs hospital, 172 and 134 veterans cemeteries. For 3 years, I fought Nancy Pelosi, who demanded that they be ripped down because obviously the great emancipator had the temerity not to mention 21st century leftist pressure groups in a speech that he gave in March of 1865. For him who shall have borne the battle and his widow and orphan. As soon as we left office, those words came down. We face I mentioned earlier, a moral crisis. A faith in our own country, a faith in the place that we have been given in the continuum of Western civilization that began in the Judean desert, that moved to Athens, Rome, London, and then finally to the United States, and to its outpost in Australia, and here in Hungary, a nation that defended the West for 1,000 years. That's right. Now we have the lowest recruiting numbers since the all-volunteer force was created, because 60% of the force comes from 11 states. They all happen to have stars on the Confederate flag. When Biden and Harris look at the military, they see red state. They have now divided the force into racial, ethnic, and sexual categories. The commandant of the superintendent of the United States Military Academy now says that the motto of the academy, an academy that that Jim graduated from in the 70s. Duty honor country is only aspirational. You can now get diplomas from our military academy that say that you are proficient in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have destroyed our physical fitness standards except for very few elite units. You can now pass the Biden Army physical fitness test with 2 miles in 25 minutes and 10 push-ups. By the way, the average 65-year-old American can walk a mile in 12 minutes. Our officer corps has become politicized. One of the things I did was when I was Undersecretary for Readiness is I eliminated the pictures and the racial descriptions of officers in their promotion jackets. One of the first things Biden did when he came in was put the racial descriptions back. But remember, we are led by people who fundamentally dislike the United States. And to play this out on the world stage, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, when Biden and Harris look at Israel and Hamas, they see critical race theory. They see oppressor and oppressed. That's what they see in the United States military. They see red state oppressors representing the Anglo-Saxon patriarchy. And I have addressed this many times, and you're doing it in Hungary. I talked to people even today at your MCC. The solution is not going to come from Washington, D.C. It's not going to be a top-down solution. The revolution in America has to come where it has always come from, and that is the people. You're not going to solve a recruiting crisis by putting out more bonuses if you don't educate your children in primary and secondary schools to be proud of their country. And also, because I don't know what the situation is in Hungary, I know it's happened in Australia. In most of our schools, the teachers' unions have demanded that physical education be removed because somebody might get his feelings hurt by not being able to climb up the road. Only 4% of American high schoolers can qualify for the old accession standards for the military that we had in place when I was Undersecretary. It is a crisis of confidence, but it is a cultural crisis that will take a tremendous fight to regain our sense of self. And I'll say it again, and I know that the Prime Minister and I have just talked about this. Without America's deterrent power, all of the tomes about alliances and good feelings and practical decision-making on the part of our enemies, that goes away. It will be open season on the West. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Happy. Who's in charge here? How much time do we have? Do we have time for another question?
Trump is coming.
The cavalry's coming. Do we have? Okay. So against my very good judgment, I'm going to take some questions from the far left. So there was one down here, and then there's a gentleman way up there. I just have to say this, not because Danube's paying me anything, because they're not. Where culture is part of the debate about national security and prosperity and solidarity. But you do not hear those conversations anywhere other than places like this where there's courage to put those conversations together, right? I think that's really, really important. Sir, you, and then we'll go up there, and that's probably going to run it. But please.
Thanks. Mike Duran from the Hudson Institute. I got a very simple question for all of you. Let's assume Donald Trump wins in November, and you can offer him one or two very practical suggestions of things that he should do right away. What are some easily doable, high-impact things that you would like to see from your point of view that could really make a difference, something that's easily achievable? Thank you.
And in keeping with the whole kind of woke tradition, we'll go left to right. So, Tony, you can start.
Well, I'm not, part of the Trump fan club, particularly, but I do think he was a better president than his predecessor and a much better president than his successor. And I reckon if he does again the sorts of things that he did or tried to do before, to cut taxes, to cut regulation, to boost the defence, to get out of all the climate cultish things, to try to drive the woke mind virus out of educational institutions and to control the borders. If he did all of those things again, I think he would be a transformational president.
Well, I think it's beyond my payroll to tell President Trump what to do if he wins the election, but I would have a very practical proposal if he asked me, in principle.
Change the ambassador in Hungary.
You're very close. You're very close. I would suggest that he selects his ambassadors before the inauguration, and he immediately launches the process in Congress, and not wait 1.5 years or I don't know what, because that would ruin his foreign policy with his allies. And we need a clear situation if it happens. If not, then everything continues as it is.
Let me make a comment about the Secretary's comment about preparation. Again, I don't speak officially for President Trump, but a transition is underway. It has been underway now for 2 years. In 2016, there was no transition. Nobody expected him to win. The institution of the Republican Party that had given us Mitt Romney, who looked like he just laid your neighbor off, did not do anything to support the rebellion. And that has changed this time. There will be extensive activity in the first week if he comes to the White House, I expect. And I think the personnel lists will be robust. On the political side, and Jim may comment on this, I do believe that, and this applies to the Vice President as well, if Mr. Trump wins, the Senate of the United States will be solidly Republican because he'll take in senators from Montana and West Virginia with him. If she wins, I think it's status quo in the Senate. And that's the key. Now, what I expect to happen in the first week, I do expect the executive orders to flow, firing every CRT facilitator in the federal government. I expect an executive order to flow, ending affirmative action at the United States Military Academy. I also expect, as the Prime Minister mentioned, the executive order will flow, killing the budgets for climate change activities. I would also expect, and this applies to our friends, our good friends, I would expect a seismic change in terms of the outlook of the State Department. That the order from the President of the United States, if any ambassador interferes in the cultural activities, the culture of the host country, and participates in political activities, that ambassador will be cashiered. And that is, and then just to finish with my former boss, Senator Helms, he always said the problem with our State Department is that we don't have an American desk. I think we'll get an American desk.
So we're going to go all the way to the top there, and then we're going to come back down over here if we have time. I am keeping score. So far, we've insulted Australians, ambassadors, and DEI directors. So I'm keeping count. Well, there's one way up on top. So he was first. So there he is. And then we'll come back down, and then actually believing in diversity, we'll let somebody with a beard ask a question. But go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. My question goes, first of all, to Mr. Storoy, but of course you can all answer if you would like to. I would focus more a little bit of our main topic, Hungary's place in the global order. Viktor Orban caused an outcry in the last months due to his visits in China, Ukraine, Russia, and the US, on the left Western side of politics, of course, but what was pretty much seen as a hopeful agent of peace. And my question to you is, how do you value Viktor Orban's role as an agent to negotiate between Russia, Ukraine, and the US, with or without Donald Trump, to end the war in Ukraine realistically? Thank you.
Well, I think that's one of the good examples, what happened after this round trip, how our partners and allies reacted, which was a hysterical reaction to something which did not have any base. Because, I mean, he really stated in advance that he is not doing this in his capacity as the President of the Council of the European Union. I think his message was that somebody should start to talk. And it's not Hungary that will solve this conflict, clearly. It's beyond our ambition. But I think he pointed at the problem that until the bigger powers are not ready to engage the warring parties, until that, the bloodshed will continue, a whole generation of Ukrainians will die, the bigger part of Ukraine, the whole infrastructure will be demolished, and at the end of the day, there will be a much weaker Ukraine to start negotiations with a Russia which will dictate. And in that respect, I think it was a very, very good message. But it's telling how our partners and allies reacted, most of them at least, repeating all the time that Prime Minister Orban did not have the permission to act like that. Why? I mean, he did that in his national capacity, and I think the message was very clear. We need some kind of talks. It's too early now. He also sent a note to our partners in the EU, making it very clear that the warring parties are not yet ready. That was his conclusion. They are not yet ready for engagement, right. But the time will come, and we have to think about it. And if the European Union wants to have a political role in any kind of solution of this conflict, then the European Union has to start to act, but it does not. And I think that's again a problem, because I mean the European Union has an ambition to be a global player politically. So if you have that ambition, then you have to engage all the parties, which is not happening right now. We don't have the solution. I mean, how should we say? The only thing is that fighting should be stopped. And although we all agree that it's aggression and it goes against international law, what Russia did, but at the same time, there's a situation now. We are in the middle of a situation. We need some realpolitik, and we have to try to draw the parties to the table, because otherwise it will be a huge destruction which will continue for years, and the losses will be immense, and it will be Europe which will have to rebuild Ukraine at the end of the day.
So we have do you have the mic? Okay, there you go. Okay, and then there's a question way up there on the top of Mount Olympus. Go ahead.
Thank you. Ori Sachar, Israel's Defense and Security Forum. Thank you so much for your remarks. I'd like to ask, given that the Israel-Hamas war is known to be a much larger story than the Gaza Strip, we can see how it has ripple effects across the globe with Russia, China, and Europe. And we can also see how in Hungary, it's one of the only countries in Europe where flying the Israel flag is not considered to be committing a DEI offense. I think what I'd like to know is, to ask you gentlemen, is how come Hungary is so uniquely supportive of Israel, of all European countries? It's a pioneer in combating anti-Semitism. And how would you explain the different approach that Europe takes to Israel as opposed to Ukraine? Thank you so much.
That's a great question. I think the issue of combating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is one of the big global issues in the world today. So I think it's worth having the whole panel talk to that. So, and maybe now we'll go right to left. I'm much more comfortable with that anyway. So you want to lead off?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that in our country, the Biden-Harris administration, the leadership of our leading universities and our major media outlets view the conflict through the eyes of critical race theory. Israel, the oppressor nation, Israel, the apartheid state, and by attacking Israel, of course in Europe, anti-Semitism is always that sad strata underneath the surface of European culture. It has been for thousands of years. But that is what has happened to the leadership of one party in our country. The Hamas wing of the Democratic Party is incredibly large. In their platform, they took out any reference to Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They took out every reference to God. Ms. Harris, when she was asked, she said, well, we have to defend Israel. And then she launched into why we have to stop the killing in Gaza because it's so one-sided. And then she regurgitated Hamas statistics. By the way, one other thing, there's a difference between the rhetoric of defending Israel and the policy of deterring Iran. Two very different things. One is an active American policy to take out the Ayatollahs, which President Trump was on the way to doing. I mean, when he left office, they were bankrupt. Soleimani was dead. They were in their box. And also, 300 of their little Russian friends had been eliminated in the Syrian desert, sending a message to Moscow. So it is a terrible example in the United States of the cultural descent of the American left, which for most of its time since the creation of the State of Israel had always been the prime defender of Israel and the Jewish homeland. We've seen that sea change. It is now the most conservative parts of our country who speak up for Israel, who believe that America is tied not only by religion, but by history and destiny to the Jewish state.
Well, for us, we have a very simple policy, actually, that we introduced in 2010 by this government, which is called zero tolerance on anti-Semitism. And it's not only a slogan, but we have prepared a legal adjustment in our legal system, and we are working very closely with the Jewish community here, and we have built a kind of alliance with the State of Israel. And because of that, we have the power to say that for the sake of public security and to maintain this policy of zero tolerance, we will not allow pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Hungary, because we saw what happened globally, not only in Western Europe, but in the US, on the campuses, in Australia, wherever, that they always turn into pro-Hamas, anti-Semitic demonstrations. And we will not allow that. And I think that's the right policy. And we are working very closely, actually, with the Israelis on many issues. And because of our history, because of our knowledge that this is bad, what happened here before, I think the Orban government has gone very far in that respect. And we will maintain that policy, and we will not change that, because we need Israel in the Middle East, and we are convinced that Israel has a right to defend itself, and it's an extended interpretation of that self-defense, because they have to fight Hamas. And there's a difference between the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza and the war in Israel, because Israel was attacked from inside by a terrorist organization. The other one is a war between two countries. Of course, there's Russia, which invaded Ukraine. But because of that, it's a different type of conflict. And that's why when I hear that argument on many occasions that Hungary has a double standard on the two conflicts, no, I don't think so, because these are two different types of conflicts.
Well, I think both conflicts are existential. I mean, if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. I think that's the simple truth. But look, you're right. Israel is fighting a just war against an apocalyptic death cult. Absolutely, it's fighting a just war. And the only just end to a just war is total victory. And that should mean the total elimination of Hamas, just as victory in the Second World War meant the total elimination of Nazism. And you can totally eliminate an ideology if you crush it sufficiently. This idea that you can't kill an idea is not quite right. So look, I'm ashamed that on the 9th of October there was a mob outside the Sydney Opera House and the images went around the world of those shameful slogans. Partly it was recent migrants from the Middle East who have brought their ancient hatreds with them, and partly it was the cultural Marxists who, as you said, Robert, see Israel as a bastion of white settler privilege. Well, that's just so wrong. It's so absolutely wrong. And in the end, the anti-Semitism, which is now rampant in Western countries, is yet another symptom of the cultural malaise, which needs to be tackled with extreme urgency if the West, which has given the world so much, is to continue to flourish.
Yeah. So before I ask you to join me in a round of applause for our truly fascinating panel, I want to say this is the most successful panel I have ever chaired since the invention of the internet, because nobody was on their cell phone for an hour. That was awesome. All right, thank you.